Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. It was early winter, and the weather had made her mark on the beguiling landscape. Trees had long since abandoned their leaves, unless they were wise enough to wear evergreen coats. And the cold weather had set in with a vengeance and anchored her roots quite firmly into the ground. The grass had become stone-washed, as the cold weather had confiscated its verdant glamour, and now carpets of snow had begun to powder the streets. But the snow was becoming heavier and heavier with every passing minute. The sky looked gloomy. It was stained with a grey apparel, and the distant panoramic mountains were heavily swathed in a glistening white glaze. There was a biting nip to the air, a chill that could quite literally sink into your bones. The local weather forecasts were warning of heavy snowfall, encouraging people not to travel or leave their homes. But I couldn't allow my life to be dictated to by the weather. I had a business to run, so for me I didn't have the luxury of turning in early for the day. I didn't want to lose out on any potential sales, no matter how scant they might be. By all accounts, all my customers on days like this, when the sunshine was a distant dream, could only ever harp about one thing: the weather. "Isn't it cold?" were the three words that were the order of the day, and the words most frequently spoken on every street corner. At the time, I was working in a stunning avant-garde clothing boutique in a rural North American mountain town. And let's just say business was booming, and certainly in the latter part of the day, which had surprised me considerably, as this was not the kind of day that you would expect to attract shoppers. The weather was absolutely freezing. It was snowing outside with heavy snowflakes thrusting themselves audaciously through the ashy sky, so that the streets and sidewalks were heavily barraged with snow. Let's just say, based from my vast experience over years of selling designer clothes, I have found people are reluctant to shop when the weather is cold, as they tend to hate taking off their clothes or trying on garments in freezing conditions. And quite frankly, who can blame them for that? I'm much the same myself. I'm a wimp when it comes to the cold weather, so removing as little clothing as possible in Arctic conditions is a natural inborn instinct that serves our best interests. Perhaps it's a survival instinct within all of us. Fortunately, I make my shop as warm as toast so that people would be less hesitant to try on some of my designer creations. I try every trick in the book to arrest people's attention by dressing up my mannequins to look as stylish as possible, so people less inclined to try something on might have a radical change of mind. I know when customers try on my clothes, they're incredibly flattering, so they're more likely to be persuaded to buy one of my garments that regretfully don't come very cheap. I tend to find that the summer and spring trade in clothing boutiques flourishes when the weather warms up. It's at thrilling times like this, when out come the wallets and the money, as people become enthusiastic about spending. But in winter those wallets don't appear to be as eager to burn any holes in people's pockets, although I do my damnedest to get people to spend money in any way I can, but it's not easy. On this particular occasion, I had been more than pleasantly surprised with all the bustling passing trade that had trudged into my boutique. It had been an auspicious, serendipitous day, based on the numbers of people that had bought clothes from me. Indeed, it had been so busy, I hadn't even shut up shop for a 15-minute snack break. I decided there had to be something in the water, as over and over again, my cash register was pinging with new purchases, and customers left my shop with smiling, satisfied faces and large pink cardboard bags containing their purchases that were elegantly wrapped in tissue paper and with the curly designer logo of my shop on the front. "I love your clothes," I heard from the customers again and again. "They're so different. They're so unique." I always knew when I started my own boutique that it was very significant to stand out as being different. The problem is if you produce a clothing range, much like your competitors, you'll be just run-of-the-mill, like any other clothing shop. People get excited when they're presented with inspirational, innovative options, and that's what I like to do with my garments, that are all made here in North America by skilled seamstresses. I think my clothes have that vintage 50s look with a modern twist to them, which people rarely like, as it's an understated classic elegance that is very feminine and always flattering. I hasten to say, it was already getting dark outside. The sunlight had been vacuumed away by the dull sky. The snow was coming down furiously, being blown by a wind into drifts, and it was impertinently intruding into shop doorways. I was about to close up in any moment and get back home as soon as I possibly could, contemplating the dreadful drive that lay ahead of me with very little enthusiasm. I hated driving when it was dark and loathed driving in hazardous conditions like this. The street with all the shop lights on had a Christmas feel about it that was so magical, so the lights twinkled like Christmas trees against the contrasting white snow. I was counting up the takings in my cash register when a mother and her daughter, who were from California, came barging into my boutique like two bulls in a china shop. Even the bell in my doorway that tingled when the customers entered the shop seemed to be particularly clamorous, as if it too had not been unaffected by this rude, fortuitous intrusion. I had never met two such ungainly, bumbling women, who literally derailed everything that they touched. Most of the local businesses had closed shop for the day, apart from a coffee shop further along the way, that was doing a bustling, busy trade, as coffee and lattes and their warm cinnamon buns that no one could resist were doing a fine trade. You could smell the cinnamon all day down the street. I would have closed up shop sooner, but I could tell by the women's expensive designer handbags they were carrying, and the hungry, eager looks on their faces, that these women intended to spend money and meant business. I was hardly going to look a gift horse in the mouth, as I could smell that cash, and the scent was sweeter than sugar candy. I could feel the familiar fluttering of excitement in my heart that always instinctively happened when I sensed a large sale was brewing. The older woman was considerably larger than her daughter. Her weight ballooned magnanimously around her middle in several rolls like a hilly valley, while her daughter was slender, her figure neat. They both had fabulous manicures and hair highlighted with hundreds of reds, hazelnuts and blondes, while their makeup was plastered on so thickly, like a warrior's war paint. "It's not too late, is it?" trills the older woman, looking at me with eyes fraught with worry. "No, I'm still open," I said, giving them a warm, encouraging smile. "Please feel free to browse through my stuff, and if you need any help, don't hesitate to give me a shout. Our newest editions are over there on the right-handed rack." The two lumbering women needed no further prompting, as they gracelessly crashed into the rails of clothes, clumsily dismantling many dresses from their racks, and neatly folded sweaters came colliding onto the floor in puddles. But the uncouth woman remained oblivious to the cumbersome chaos they were causing, and I didn't particularly care if indeed they were going to spend money. They acted like two klutzy, excited people that are ruffling with butter fingers through clothes at a jumble sale, determined to get the very best bargains. "May I try these on?" says the woman, inelegantly holding up a pile of clothes in her hands, so thick that I nearly passed out from shock at the quantity of clothes she was showing me. I nodded in bemusement. "Go ahead," I said. The younger daughter did much the same, and to my horror the two uncoordinated women decided to change in the middle of the shop floor, tearing their clothes off and standing in front of me in their undies, completely unself-conscious. In truth, I admired their brazen audacity, as I'd never be so bold to behave so presumptuously. So to see this confidence in other people, I couldn't help but secretly admire it. I'd have loved to have been so self-assured myself. I'm that typical shy girl that hides behind the closet when I get dressed. But not them. They were happy to hang out their dirty laundry, no matter how stained or imperfect it was, for the entire world to see, with no apologies and definitely no shame. "It's easier to dress here," explained the older woman. "No one's going to come into the shop this late, so why bother to change in the changing rooms? It's only going to create more fuss." I decided not to say anything, as the two women tried on clothes and cack-handishly threw stuff they didn't want onto the floor, which I hurriedly picked up after them fastidiously, replacing it back on the shelves and the hangers. But I don't know why I even bothered, as those two oafish women would be back at the racks again, rifling through the clothes. They were like two starving homeless people outside a bakery dumpster, diving for all the baked goods that had been tossed out the day before. There was an excitable energy in the shop that was infectious, as both mother and daughter spurred each other on. I'm afraid to say there wasn't a single item of clothing in my shop safe from their clutches, as everything on display was at serious risk of being trampled to death by two trumpeding, lumbering elephants, and the slimmer woman may as well have been as large as a male elephant herself, as she was so ham-handed with everything, and probably even more graceless than her mother, if that were at all possible. I watched in stunned silence as the two women paraded the clothes in front of me, like a fashion show, on which I had become the commentator, or the cheering crowd, if you like. The mature woman kept looking up at me and saying, "Does this make me look fat?" "Of course not," I'd lie. "You look perfectly lovely." The truth was the bigger woman looked fat in everything, which was no fault of the clothes, but to be fair, she looked good in what she did try on, and that is what mattered at the end of the day. The slimmer daughter was squealing in delight as she tried on all my clothes. It didn't surprise me, of course, that she looked $1 million in everything, but she was like a clothes horse who could model anything she liked and looked terrific, but she knew it. "Oh, Mum, look at this," her daughter would say, twirling around as she stared at her reflection in the mirror over and over again. I knew that this was a young woman that loved to gaze at her reflection. She was in love with it, but then the mirror did not lie, and it seemed to agree with her that she did indeed look great. "Oh, darling, you look quite wonderful," her mother purred, looking up at me proudly. "Hasn't she got the most marvellous figure? Everything in the right place. I do envy her, you know. I was once as slim as her, but after childbirth, everything headed south. You know how it does. The same will happen to her after she's had her first baby, as I keep telling her, but she's so naively ignorant about those kind of things, as they all are at this age. They all seem to think they'll be thin forever." "Yes, she's got a lovely figure," I say. "Everything looks perfectly lovely on her." "But then, that being said, my daughter would look great in a sack," the woman continued. "But in your clothes, I have to say she looks like a princess. I must admit the cuts of your clothing make even a big woman like myself look good. It's not easy to find such forgiving clothes, you know." "That's because a good cut can really transform your appearance," I said. The daughter looked at her mother, with a big frown on her face, as if she was faced with a dreadful problem. "What is it, sweetheart? You look so confounded. Whatever is the matter?" "I don't know what dress to choose, Mum. I like them all." She paused for a moment, putting on a very sorrowful face, and a big tear spilled down her cheeks. "I don't want to have to choose, Mum. I like all these clothes. How can I possibly just only choose one?" "Sweetheart, don't you dare cry. I can't bear to see you so distressed. If you like all those clothes, then we'll take them all. There's no big deal about it." The daughter's face visibly relaxed, but I knew that she knew that this is exactly what her mother would say. She probably turned on the waterworks like a tap whenever she wanted to get her own way, as she had masterfully figured out how to manipulate her mother with a superbly alarming success. I'm quite sure if her mother had said no, she would have sulked and wailed all the way back home. She looked the type who always got her way. Before long, there is the most massive pile of clothes stashed up at my cash register, but there are equally as many spilled on the floor, and my poor little boutique looks like it's suffering from the aftermath of a great tsunami, and my two customers were the thunderous waves that had turned my shop into a sad wasteland. It was incredible. "We are from California," the woman told me. "We're going back in the morning. We saw your shop yesterday, but we couldn't come in as we were going on a hike. I have to tell you, we could never find such a gloriously unique boutique like yours in California. So many of the clothes there are much the same, but your boutique is very vintage, but with the modern twist, and I really love it. I'm glad you like it. My object is to sell clothes you can't find anywhere else. People like to stand out from the crowd, you know." "My friends in California are going to be so jealous," said the daughter, smugly. "But I ain't going to tell them about your shop. Me and my mother will be coming back very soon when you bring out your new ranges." When the mature woman pays for their garments, she opens up her oversized Gucci bag and brings out piles and piles of cash, tied up neatly in tight little bundles, almost as if she's robbed a bank. I'm amazed that anyone would dare walk around carrying so much cash, but I say nothing, and happily ring up the transaction, my eyes popping out of my heads at the huge amount they've spent with me. But I'm not complaining. I'm over the moon. "It was a pleasure doing business with you. I hope to see you again," I say to the two women, as they walk out of the shop, weighed down heavily by dozens of my pink bags. I was certainly very glad of their custom, but my goodness, my store looked like a bomb site. I knew I couldn't leave it in this condition for my shop assistant in the morning, and the clothes also risked becoming crumpled, lying strewn over the polished floor like this. My shop assistant would almost certainly believe that our boutique had been raided during the night, or a whole herd of trumpeting elephants had invaded our shop. It was hard to believe that two women could cause such pandemonium, and it did leave me wondering what their hotel room looked like. I had visions of the cleaners entering their room to be greeted by suitcases bursting at the seams with clothes spilling out, and trespassing rudely over every available surface. And I was certain their bathroom was covered in lipsticks, eyeshadow palettes, and mascaras, and there was possibly no area that had not been contaminated by all their stuff. Still, I shouldn't complain. I had made a whopping sale, and I was incredibly glad about that. It took me a long while to clean up the mess in my boutique, as I folded up sweaters neatly, replacing them on shelves, and hung up dresses according to their sizes. I then finally cashed up, and so by the time I closed the shop up, there was not a single soul in sight. All the shops along the street were lighted up, but everyone had long since abandoned their stores. And even a coffee shop and local restaurant had thought better about staying open on a perilous night like this, when the weather was not your friend. I was, of course, the only mug that had decided that I would shut up shop so late. My boyfriend Jonathan was not best pleased with me, and kept sending me urgent text messages telling me to hurry back home, in case things get much worse. "Have you listened to the weather forecast?" he chided. "The weather is treacherous. They're saying no one should be out on the roads. What's keeping you so long?" "I told you," I texted back. "I had a late customer, well, 2 customers, who bought the shop. Don't you worry, I'll be back soon." "Make sure you drive back safely," came the swift reply. I noticed that there were no cars in the parking bay. Everything was swathed under magnanimous blankets of snow. The world was richly carpeted in white, with the naked bronzed boughs of the trees heavily laden with glistening white icicles. It was so quiet outside that the extreme soundless silence was deafening, although the snow continued to flurry down in a very audacious snowstorm that seemed determined to persist in its folly. I knew Jonathan was right, and that the roads could potentially be treacherous, but I was judicious enough to have all-weather tyres on my Land Rover, so I was certain I'd be all right. I made my way to my truck, having put on sensible walking shoes and a puffy windbreaker over my jeans. It was freezing cold, and the icy chill of the bracing wind numbed my fingers, despite the fact that my hands were swathed in thick fleece-lined gloves, designed to keep out the winter chill. I sat in the car to warm up the engine, and then with my ice scraper I got outside and scraped away the snow from my windscreen. I was now ready to go home, and sitting comfortably in the leather seats of my car, with my safety belt buckled. I pressed down the accelerator and made my way cautiously down the road, with the radio blaring. I can't stress enough, be circumspect, folks. The weather out there is exceedingly treacherous. If you're out and about, drive very carefully. And if you can possibly avoid making any journeys now, you would be well advised to do so. It is far better to stay safely at home and to listen to some of the music that we have in line for you to keep you so entertained you won't regret keeping tuned in with us. When I left the cheerful lights of the town, it became tenebrously dark, and without the background lights to offer me comfort and reassurance, I began to panic. I knew this journey was a mistake, but it was too late. I was on the road now. It might have been wiser for me to stay at the shop. I had a pop-up mattress there, along with a sleeping bag, especially accessible for such occasions as this. And there was a little kitchenette with a fridge stocked with food. It would have been much wiser for me to stay there than brace these foreboding elements that greeted me with the insidious charm of an ice queen, hell-bent on extracting her ultimate revenge on me. The beastly weather was extreme, which was unusually freakish for this time of the year. Now I was on higher ground, I was greeted to an unfriendly blizzard, and the snowflakes were so big and so thick that I had to lean forward and peer through the windscreen to see my way ahead. And even in my robust truck, I was very afraid that I would veer off the narrow road. I was moving towards my home in a rural location, nestled against the imposing views of the panoramic mountains. But I could see nothing now. There wasn't a single truck on the road, and I suddenly felt so terribly alone, so isolated. It was most distressing. I drove this route every single day of my life, but now I felt disorientated, very confused. Everything had become ambiguously obscure, locked under the tenebrous blanket of an unforgiving dark night, where the stiff-necked moon had perversely hidden herself behind cloud cover and had become terribly shy. It would seem her timorous cousins, the stars, also shrunk back into their shells like frightened tortoises and simply refused to shine. So there was an airy, inauspicious feeling about this bodefully oppressive night that sent a chill transcending down my spine, and a bitter taste interloping in the back of my throat. I suddenly came to the horrifying revelation that I was lost, but I still proceeded forward, hoping with bated breath that something would be recognisable to me sooner or later. Soon I came to an unfamiliar crossroads where I changed gears and prepared to stop, as the last thing I wanted to do was to apply my brakes and start skidding. Where the hell was I? I felt as if I was playing blind man's buff, as out here everything under the grim shadow of darkness clandestinely stole the definitive details of the familiar landmarks with a hungry gluttony. It was hard to discern anything. It was like everything looked the same, as the whole landscape was buried under this thick snow, and the charmless night did little to make visibility clear. In my bright headlights I saw trees on both sides of the road, thick congregations of spruce trees. I was certain I missed a vital turning somewhere along the way. I could not get a cell phone connection, as a GPS signal is often difficult to receive in the mountains. I decided that the right-hand turning looked more familiar than the left, so I veered down that road, but to my horror the snowdrifts here were so thick that I was certain I might get stuck. I hadn't bargained for any of the roads to be this hazardous, and I felt an encroaching sense of fear trespass upon my confidence. I told myself to get a grip and hold it together. "Don't panic," I told myself. "This isn't a train smash. You'll get through this snowstorm safely, and you'll be back home soon, drinking hot chocolate with your boyfriend and laughing about all this behind closed doors." The thought warmed the cockles of my heart, and to my surprise I discovered another set of tyre tracks in the snow and realised that, much like myself, some other foolish individual had taken it upon themselves to travel in these outrageous conditions. So my ignorance was in good company, it would seem, but maybe they'd managed to make it through, so I could do exactly the same, I told myself encouragingly. When I turned the next bend, my car almost dragooned into a truck on the side of the road. It was parked haphazardly opposite a couple of spruce trees, but it didn't appear to have crashed into anything, so what was it doing there? Maybe it was stuck, I thought, or had slewed off the road, as it was not a four-wheel drive. I immediately drove up to the car and stopped. I needed to see if anybody needed my help, or even a lift. I removed the torch from the cubbyhole in my truck and climbed out of my Land Rover. I was amazed to find that one of the doors of the stationary truck was wide open, which seemed more than a little incongruous. It was so icy out here. The wind punnelled at my cheeks. I could see footsteps from the truck leading through the spruce trees, and in the distance I could see the silhouettes of a farmhouse with its lights brightly on. I realised at once that the driver had obviously walked to the farmhouse to get help. I was about to return to my truck when I heard a cry. I immediately went to investigate and flashed my torch into the open car door of the truck, and sitting there strapped into a child-friendly seat was a little toddler. I could hardly believe my eyes. The child was wearing a blue onesie with boots. I had no idea about the age of the child. "Hello, how are you?" I said to the little one. "What's your name?" The child looked at me, beginning to whimper. My presence had grievously upset him or her. I looked around for the mother, but could not see her anywhere around, apart from the trail of footsteps that led directly through the trees towards the farmhouse. I knew at once what had happened. The mother had obviously gone to get help, but she had inadvertently left her child on the car seat. Although possibly able to walk, it wouldn't have been able to walk very far, and certainly not in those dreadful shoes it was wearing. It mortified me that the mother had forgotten to close the door behind herself in these freezing conditions outside. It seemed a nonsensical thing to do. But given the close location of the farmhouse, I was certain she would not be gone for terribly long, and would be back with reinforcements to pick up her child, but had obviously forgotten to close the door, which was a foolish mistake to make, but it could happen to any of us. I wanted to take the toddler with me back into the warmth of my own car, back to the security of my home. But if I did that, supposing I was accused of kidnapping this child? The thought horrified me. Instead, I went back to my truck and removed some blankets from the trunk, which I wrapped around the little boy or girl. I thought it might be a boy because it was dressed in a blue onesie, but you couldn't be sure. The child stared at me, saying nothing, putting its thumb into its mouth. "Your mummy won't be long," I told the toddler. "She's gone to the farmhouse to get help. She'll be back in any minute, I'm sure." I then closed the door behind me, in two minds whether I was doing the right thing or not. I studied the trail of footprints and convinced myself that the child was absolutely fine, and his mother would be back soon. I climbed somewhat reluctantly back into the Land Rover and continued the drive. The snow continued to flurry down, but I passed a barn on the corner of the road that was a conspicuous landmark I knew very well, and I sighed with relief because I knew exactly where I was, and I was very nearly home. When I drew outside the family ranch-style home, my boyfriend hurried out of the house, his face dappled with relief. "Oh, thank God you're all right. I was so worried about you. Come in before you catch your death of cold. Honestly, what are you like staying at the boutique so late in the day, with all those weather warnings?" I watched my boyfriend bustling around the range, making me some hot chocolate. He knew how much I thoroughly enjoyed the drink after a hard day's work at the boutique. I could see something bubbling on the stove. "You been cooking?" I asked in surprise. "Something smells insanely delicious." "I was very worried about you," he chided. "I had to keep myself busy, didn't I? It's chicken stew with dumplings and rice, and there's some crispy potatoes still cooking in the oven." "Have I got good taste in men or not?" I tease. "What did I do to deserve you? I must have been a saint in a previous life. You'll never believe what happened to me this evening. I was driving down that road. There were snowdrifts everywhere. I saw a truck pulled over on the side. I stopped to see if the driver was all right. I think they'd gone off to get help, but they'd left their toddler in the back seat with the door wide open. The poor thing could have frozen to death. I mean, who does that? It's insane. I think the mother in her haste must have forgotten to close the door behind her. So I put blankets on the child to keep it warm while it waited for its mother." "You mean you left the kid behind in the truck all on its own? Are you completely crazy? Why didn't you bring it back to this house with you? Have you any idea how cold it is out there? It's not good for a little one to be stuck in a car, you know." I decided not to interfere, as the mother was obviously getting help, and if she returned to find her kid missing, she'd scream blue murder. I wouldn't want to be accused of kidnapping, would I? "We need to check that the child is all right. You don't want to be accused of negligence, do you, for abandoning a child like that? We need to get to it at once. We'll leave a note in the truck for the mother, with our phone number on it, telling her that we have her kid and it's safe and well. You really should not have left her kid alone like that, even at the risk of being called a kidnapper. The child's safety is very important. And besides, you don't know if the mother did get help. It would be judicious of us to check on the child, to make sure it's absolutely all right. Thoughts of that piping hot chocolate and that delicious stew that awaited me were put on the back burner, as I reluctantly followed my boyfriend to my truck. We were taking my Land Rover, as it was still warm, and only had a thin film of snow on its windscreen that was quickly wiped away with my wipers. But I allowed Jonathan to drive, as my confidence in driving in these treacherous conditions was waning rapidly. "This is dreadful weather," says Jonathan. "Imagine being stuck here in these atrocious conditions. Thank God you've got a Land Rover with decent tyres. This road is not designed for anything less than a four-wheeler. And even that is a struggle." Our truck trailed through the thick snow, and finally we reached the car that I'd discovered earlier on. My boyfriend flashed his torchlight over the ground and remarked at the massive footprints we saw. "Bloody hell! Look at these! Look at the size of these enormous feet! There must be a giant living up there at the farmhouse." "Oh my word! You're right! They're humongous! I've never seen feet so large. They make mine look like a doll's." I was appalled at the size of the feet and secretly thought the owner of these feet could easily enter the Guinness Book of Records for the world's largest feet. I almost wanted to meet that farmer for myself, just because of the curiosity factor. "Oh my goodness gracious me! That mother still left the door wide open," said Jonathan, inspecting the back of the truck. "But the good news, I have to tell you, is that the child is finally gone, so you were absolutely right. The mother obviously came back to pick up her child. Your gut instinct was on the money." "Well, let's go back home, I say. I'm starving hungry. I could eat a horse, let alone your chicken stew." It was so wonderful to be back home. Me and Jonathan sat by a crackling fire, eating our chicken casserole, and watching a lovely movie on television. We gave no further thought to the toddler that I'd seen earlier on in the evening. In truth, I felt so cosy, swaddled up in the warmth, and soon exhaustion consumed me, dictating my decision to retire to bed, as it had been a long but highly rewarding day. I was awoken in the middle of the night to hear this crashing sound. I was surprised to see that Jonathan was fast asleep and had not woken up. I was absolutely certain that one of the downstairs windows had somehow come off its hinges and was banging against the walls. The last thing I wanted was to invite any icy cold air into the house. It was cold enough already in our home. We didn't need an open window to add to the misery. I groaned in frustration. We had no central heating in our bedroom, so getting out of bed was like stepping out into a refrigerator. We had an oil-fired range, a wood-burning stove, and fireplaces throughout that kept our unusual ranch-style home warm. I say unusual because it boasted an upstairs, and most ranch-style homes are just bungalows. But on the second story there was no heating apart from our electric blanket, so I hurriedly grabbed my dressing gown, which I tied around my waist, and then I slipped my feet into my slippers as I trudged down the stairs. It was bitterly cold, and I'd have loved nothing better than to stay in bed. Thank goodness the night lights were on throughout the house, so I could see my way clearly, but to my surprise there were no windows left open. I realised the banging sound was coming from the front door. I then discerned that someone must be there. I wasn't worried about this revelation, as we didn't have issues with crime in our part of the world, so I just assumed that someone had got stranded in the snow. It had happened before, and I've taken in strangers in my home overnight, when the weather has been so grim. It's something we mountain folk do, without even batting an eyelid. I opened the door, pulling back the latch. The wind violently thrashed through the open doorway, wailing and moaning, as it lifted up dustings of snow, so that icy cold particles brushed against my cheeks. What I see is so surreal that I'm convinced that I'm experiencing a lucid dream. Standing there in the snow is a female Bigfoot. She must have been the creature that had pounded on my door, despite the fact that these creatures have a reputation for being notoriously evasive. She had somehow stepped out of the natural rhythm of her reticent ways, over the threshold and boundaries of her comfort zone, to get my attention. Up until this point in time, I'd truly believed Bigfoots were just creatures of pulp fiction, but now my presumptions were proved horribly wrong. The Bigfoot was standing there with the toddler on her shoulders, which she lowered and handed over to me. The toddler was crying in protest. It wanted to stay with the Bigfoot and wanted nothing to do with me. I took the toddler from the Bigfoot. She spoke to me in a strange tongue, but I understood her words, for they seemed to be automatically translated in my mind. I took the toddler. It was alone in the car. But you came to look for it, so I followed you home to bring him back to you. Amatila potabisafobo, amasina sonabo, inalinobo. I stared at the creature in awe, baffled by its supreme intelligence and human-like appearance. There are no words to describe how intimidating this ambiguous creature was. And despite the fact that she was so human, if I'd encountered her in the countryside, I might well have run a mile. She was lofty, majestic, incredibly impressive. She towered at 8 foot tall, was possibly about 700 pounds. I couldn't see her features clearly, as the moonlight remained reticent and subdued, still cloaked by a foggy mist, but the outside light from the front door highlighted her obscure features. The Bigfoot was covered in long flowing hair, and appeared to be wearing some kind of animal skin around her body. She was built like an army tank. She had small breasts and the most gentle human face I've ever seen, with deep-set dark eyes filled with a tender compassion. "Thank you," I said. The creature nodded. She turned around at one point and looked at me again, and nodded again. I stood there in the doorway with the toddler in my arms, as I watched the Bigfoot finally gliding away, until she was gone. The toddler began to scream again, especially after the Bigfoot had left him. It was clear where his priorities lay. I managed to calm him down, bringing him into the house. If the Bigfoot had called the toddler a boy, then I believed her. He was obviously a boy. By this time my boyfriend Jonathan is standing at the bottom of the staircase, having been woken up by the child's screaming outbursts. "What the hell is going on? Where did he come from?" he asks, looking incredulous. "I don't know how to tell you this, Jonathan, because you're not going to believe a word I tell you, but I promise you it's true, as incredulous as it may sound. But a female Bigfoot dropped off the toddler a moment ago. She was banging on the door, so I opened it to her. She saw us looking for him earlier in the evening when we went back to the truck. She'd seen him alone in the truck, so she rescued the boy, obviously worried that he'd come to some harm or even freeze to death. She followed us back to our house to drop off the kid." "How do you know she did this?" "Well, she told me." My boyfriend looked bemused, as if I'd slapped him over the head with an axe pick, as he tried to assimilate what I was saying. "You saw a Bigfoot, and it spoke to you. Do you realize how crazy you sound?" "I know it sounds crazy, but it's absolutely true. It appears to be able to communicate telepathically, even though it does speak in its own strange language." My boyfriend opens the front door, and when he sees the large trail of oversized feet in the snow leading directly back to the woods, he turns around to me and says, "Well, I believe you. Look at the size of those feet. Those were not made by a normal man." "You say the creature spoke to you in English?" "In my head, yes. It was telepathic." "Oh, goodness gracious, look!" I say to my boyfriend, lifting the toddler's nappy area to my nose. "He smells pongy. I think he's done a poop in his pants. And we don't have any nappies. What are we going to do?" I hurried off to clean the toddler up, and managed to find a thin hand towel and some safety pins to make him a makeshift nappy, and then I put him on the settee and covered him with blankets. "I've just been on the phone to the police," my boyfriend told me. "They'll be here in the morning to pick up the toddler." The very next day, a female and male officer arrived at our front door to pick up the toddler. "It's a very big blessing that you picked up the toddler," they told us. "The child's grandmother was taking care of the little mite. She was driving on those treacherous roads and went skidding to the side. She was very frightened about driving any further in those conditions, so she decided to go and get help at the farmhouse that she saw through the trees. She went to retrieve her grandson from the back of the truck, and clean forgot about him. She said she was feeling a bit strange, but she went to the farmhouse, knocked at the door, and had some kind of dreadful seizure. The kindly people gave her a room for the night. She panicked when she woke up in the morning and suddenly remembered she'd forgotten all about her little grandchild. She hurried back to the car, fearing the worst, frightened by what she would find. She was certain her grandchild would have frozen to death overnight. She remembered she'd forgotten to shut the door after her. But when she got to the truck, her grandchild was missing. She was in a dreadful state about that, as the child's seat was still there, but the child was gone. She thought a coyote or fox had eaten him. So when you phoned to say you had the toddler, she was so relieved. Do you realize you saved that child's life? It could have frozen to death in that car. 1 week later, the door of my boutique tingled, and an elderly woman entered. She gave me a warm smile and began to ferret through my clothes very elegantly. She had a shock of white hair and pale blue eyes. I would put her in her late 70s, early 80s, although I couldn't be sure. She was an elegant woman who looked as if in her younger days she had been a ballerina. It would seem her back was as straight as a pencil. She walked with a graceful deportment. She finally chose a couple of dresses to purchase and brought them over to me to the cash register for me to ring up. You know, I love your clothes. They're so incredibly feminine. They have a hint of the 50s about them, which is one of the things I like about them. One of my friends was wearing one of your creations the other day. I said to her, "You have to tell me where you bought that dress." Then she told me her best-kept secret, the name of your boutique, so here I am. Glad to hear it, I said. I think these clothes will look great on you. Thank you, dear. I'm treating myself, especially after the shock I had last week. I figured I needed some spoiling. What happened last week, I asked. Would you believe it? I was driving in the deep snow with my grandson. I had to look after him for my daughter. He's a toddler and he was sitting in the back seat. I'm a dreadful driver at the very best of times, and I had a full-blown panic attack driving in those treacherous conditions. I knew I couldn't go any further, so I climbed out of my truck with the full intention of getting help from a nearby farmhouse I'd seen not too far from the road. I became so disorientated and confused. I left my grandson in the back of the truck. I clean forgot about him, can you believe it? And when I reached the farmhouse, I had a full-blown seizure. The kindly couple found me a bed for the night, and when I woke up in the morning, I suddenly remembered I'd forgotten about my grandson, that he was still in the back of the truck. I was terrified he'd have frozen to death, because I'd left the door wide open. But when I returned to the truck, he wasn't there. The door was closed, but I knew I'd left it open, so I wondered if a coyote had got my grandchild, and that the heavy wind had blown the truck door shut. I phoned up the police at once, fearing the very worst, but someone had rescued my grandson. I've never been so relieved in my life. I do need to thank the person or the people that saved my grandson's life. There's no need, I said, smiling. You're thanking her right now. I was the one that discovered your grandchild. Is this a joke? She asked me. No, it's not. In that case, I must insist you join me for lunch today. My way of saying thank you. I would have liked to have given the Bigfoot full credit for her significant part in this story, but some secrets are best not shared. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was an indelible, imperishable day, as it was one that she was unlikely to ever forget, for this was not your run-of-the-mill standard funeral. This was saying a permanent farewell to her very best friend Debbie Greentree. For some people she knew the memory of this day would float away like a feather on the wind, soon to be forgotten, and so would Debbie Greentree's precious memory. As tragic as that may sound, that was life for you. Things moved forward on the roller coaster of time, where the present speedily overtook the past, and the past is left behind, taking a back seat in your mind, so your focus becomes on the current moment. She knew there would be a day when the locals in town would not remember Debbie, like you don't recall what you ate on your birthday 3 years ago. Suffice to say, with the passing of time, much is forgotten, so much is lost, memories are erased, but what is important, what is significant stays with you forever. It permanently sticks to the enduring, ineffaceable postcards of your mind. It can never fade, because of the resolutely stubborn, unfading impression that it made on your life at the time. In Jackie's case, Debbie Greentree's memory was like that. Debbie had been like a cherished sister to her, the sister she never had and had always wanted, her closest, most beloved friend, whom had been so cruelly taken from her life far too young, when she had her whole life ahead of her. She thought that Debbie would be a part of her life forever, but it was not to be. It was so surreal that something like this could have happened to her, something so unexpected, so out of the blue. Jackie had never thought that death was something that was a threat to her generation. Let's just say until now, her life had been peppered with a veil of invincibility, as in her young, naive eyes, ignorant of many sobering truths, she had falsely assumed that death was an exclusive club for senior, mature members only to join, rather like a bridge club or a bowling group. Younger people weren't members of this exclusive club. But how wrong Jackie had been about that. Death is no respecter of age or persons. Some are taken from the world long before their time, far too young. Debbie Greentree was a member of that exclusive club. As fate had firmly decided that she would be exiting this planet sooner rather than later, and in Jackie's mind that was grossly unfair. She reflects on the hours before Debbie had met her fortuitous end, and shudders to think that she too might have ended up in the very same watery grave with her friend. By all accounts, the hands of fate had serendipitously stepped in and put a spanner in the works that had overturned their plans in a way that neither of the girls had anticipated or expected. It would seem that she and Debbie were planning to go to a party together that night. Indeed, they'd been looking forward to it forever and a day, as this party was exceedingly special. It was to celebrate the 25th birthday of Victoria Lewis Gray, who had been to school with the girls, and whose affluent father had pockets so deep that he owned yachts and aeroplanes and houses in exotic sunny locations around the globe. The very extravagant event was being hosted at an upmarket venue outside Portland that people had been talking about for weeks on end. It was the kind of spectacular birthday celebration that you didn't want to turn down under any circumstances, as no expense had been spared. It was rumoured and speculated that there would be marvellously magnificent carved statues made out of ice, and delicious food on offer produced by an award-winning chef dripping with illustrious international awards. The party entertainment was Las Vegas style in every regard, with not-to-be-missed comedians, dance shows and fireworks displays. So this was a celebration one would be foolish to turn down. And there was going to be music and dancing, and an acclaimed DJ who knew how to turn every party into a dazzling success. It was not the kind of party you would want to miss. Jackie had lost her desire to go to this party, when only a couple of hours before the event she'd found out from a well-meaning good friend of hers that her boyfriend, Nick Rothberger, had cheated on her with Letitia Baker. Jackie knew Letitia would be in attendance at that party, probably acting nonchalant, as if nothing had happened. Jackie couldn't stomach the idea of going to that party now. She was consumed with the devastating hurt of her boyfriend's treachery. When you feel that deflated and down in the dumps, even the brightest sunset on the horizon will not attract your attention, let alone a party that had appeared so promising from the beginning, but now had lost its appeal. She would not be going to that party. She was sure about that. Everybody knew about Letitia Baker. She had a notorious reputation as the boyfriend scavenger, who seemed to have this incredible ability to bulldoze relationships with an astounding efficiency, so that the relationship she willfully vandalized with her artful seduction would come crumbling down like the walls of a dilapidated building. Many believed that Letitia did this on purpose, almost like satisfying an annoying itch she was desperate to scratch. She clearly loved causing devastation wherever she went. It was as if she wanted to prove that relationships that seemed so steadfastly secure were anything but. Nothing was as secure and solid as you thought it was, as even a bank vault had its weak link. It was as if Letitia had the secret combination number of the lock or the skeleton keys to break into relationships at random, destroying everything in her wake, so that you were left with the scant remains or beleaguered grey ashes of what you believed was once so very good. A little like an infestation of moths that has eaten away at your best woolen sweater. Letitia came from a broken home. Some believed that her insatiable attraction towards men, that were not otherwise available, was her cunning way of getting back at her father, who had abandoned her when she was a young girl. Somehow wrecking relationships for her was some kind of divine justice, or payback if you like, that brought her a huge measure of personal satisfaction. "See," she would say, gloating proudly, "those two were together for 7 years, and you thought it was rock solid, did you? But I had that man eating out of my hands." "Why would you do something so mean?" her girlfriends would ask her. "Please," she would say, "I've done so-and-so a favour." Now she knows her man wasn't as committed as she thought he was. For Jackie, this startling revelation that her boyfriend she'd been dating for the last 5 years, whom she thought was decidedly faithful, had cheated on her with Letitia. It was like caustic acid burning in her guts. She had felt so numb, so betrayed. Her churning stomach was in a tangle of knots. Suffice to say, all morning she'd been throwing up the contents of her stomach. She was not sure why she reacted like this, but the vomiting seemed to purge out her embittered feelings. She didn't know who she hated more, her boyfriend for cheating on her, or Letitia for seducing him so easily. It was not as if the men in town did not know what Letitia was like. Everybody did. She was the explosive firecracker you daren't light up on the 4th of July, as you might just blow off your hand in the process. She was the dangerous firecracker which came with a red warning sign that said, "Light this at your own risk, highly combustible, exceedingly dangerous." "What on earth is wrong with you, Jackie?" her mother had said, looking at her concerned. "You're green at the gills. Did you eat something that didn't agree with you?" she asks her daughter, putting a cool hand on her forehead. "You seem so hot and sweaty," she said, looking alarmed. "You look as if you're coming down with a fever of some kind. I think you should have a good lie down. Forget the party that you and Debbie were planning to attend tonight. I know you've been so looking forward to it for ages, but I can assure you that if you're feeling rotten, you're not going to want to go. And if you do go, you'll regret it. Believe me, I know about these things." "I'll be all right, Mum," says Jackie, "but I think I have eaten something a bit odd. I shan't go to that party. I'm not up to it." "Good girl. That's a wise decision. You look dreadfully peaky, if you don't mind my saying so. I am rather worried you're coming down with something. You don't look at all good. If I were you, I'd go straight up to bed." When Jackie's boyfriend Nick had phoned her that morning, he had apologised profusely for what had happened, as word on the wind had told him that Jackie had found out about his duplicity, and so he was obsequiously trying to persuade her that their night of passion had meant absolutely nothing, and that for some incongruous, unfathomable reason, he was not responsible for his actions, as Letitia Baker had deliberately enticed him into her arms, so it was all her fault, of course. "I don't know what to say. I feel very, very ashamed. I don't even know how it happened. But you know it's you I love. You know what Letitia's like. She came on strong." "And that's your pathetic excuse, is it? You know what Letitia's like. But like a lamb to the slaughter, you allowed her to seduce you. You have no willpower, no self-restraint. You couldn't resist her allure, despite the fact you knew it would destroy us. If you love someone, it should be easy to say no to a woman who's throwing herself at you. You couldn't say no to her, could you? That speaks volumes. It shows me that our relationship has not been built on strong foundations. Maybe Letitia did me a favour. She exposed how pathetically insipid, shallow and insincere you really are. But perhaps I knew it all along anyway, deep inside me. But I didn't want to admit it to myself. Letitia just exposed it." "Don't be like that, Jackie. It meant nothing, it really did. It was a dreadful mistake. Why won't you believe me? It was a once-off. It'll never, ever happen again. I promise you that. That woman, you have no idea, Jackie. She's like a snake in the grass. She coils herself around your neck like a boa constrictor, squeezes the life out of you. That girl's not right in the head. She's got big issues. I mean serious mental issues. I think she's a misogynist. I'm sure of it. And my bet is it goes back to the anger she had towards her father. And she still has, I imagine. I think she's deliberately setting traps for men, waiting for them to bite the bait. I'm pretty sure she's a narcissist as well. You knew all that already, so don't start making excuses to me, Nick. You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew what Letitia was like, and yet you were so beguiled, you couldn't say no. So stop making excuses. You're right, Letitia is a misogynist, possibly a narcissist too. But you still allowed yourself to be ensnared in the fibres of her silken web, didn't you? You've seen how she's massacred other relationships in the past, but you still became embroiled with her. Your brains are in your pants, Nick, and you deserve everything you get. You don't know what she's like. When she comes on to you, Jackie, you really have no idea. She is quite the temptress, and it's difficult to say no to her. That's no excuse. I'm not going to sit here and dignify you with a response by listening to you making up some pathetic excuse like this. You cheated on me, Nick. It's over between us. It's simple. When the trust is gone, there's no point in pursuing a relationship. If I did, I would have very little self-respect. Please don't be like this. We need to talk. Before Nick could say anything else, Jackie had thrown the phone back on the hook, while a long trail of hot tears began to trickle down her cheeks, so the mascara on her eyelashes dragged down her face in black streams, while she choked back the tears, her tongue tasting the saltiness and the ghastly taste of the bitter bile rising up in the back of her throat. I'm not coming to the party tonight, she told Debbie Greentree, who was borrowing her grandfather's car to take them there. I'm sorry, I just can't. I feel rotten. You're kidding, came her best friend's startled voice. We've been planning this for ages. What's wrong with you? Are you sick or something? We discussed our clothes we would be wearing at length. Don't you remember? You were going to wear that gorgeous floating aquamarine dress you bought. And now you don't want to come? That's insane. I thought you and Nick would be eager to come to the party. My grandfather has agreed to look after Daisy for me. Everything's been fastidiously planned. I know, and I'm so dreadfully sorry, really I am. I'm not sick. Nick cheated on me. There was a stiff silence on the other end of the phone. And then one word. Letitia! That's right, Letitia. You've got to be bloody kidding me. Your Nick cheated on you with Letitia. What the hell is wrong with him? He needs a brain transplant. When will the men in this town learn that Letitia is like a stone fish? You touch her and you're pretty much dead. Nick and you were so solid. Why would he do this to you? He claimed she was a temptress and he couldn't resist her seductive allure. Tell me something I don't know. I'm a victim of that woman's wrath, remember? A broken relationship to show for it, and a 10-year-old daughter to boot. I had to raise myself because her father conveniently disappeared off the face of the earth and can't be traced. Is there any man that is capable of not being speared by that woman's poison? I don't even know why they're so easily seduced by her. I mean, she's not even that attractive, but she obliterates everything she touches with remarkable efficiency. I've never known anybody like her. I can't believe that Nick fell for her spell. Jackie reflects about Debbie's comments for a moment, as a picture of Letitia floats into her mind, reminding herself that she's viewing Letitia from a woman's perspective, not from the eyes of a man, who would perceive her quite differently. This she does know. Let's just say in her eyes, Letitia is nothing special. She looks like the girl next door. Not that there's anything wrong with looking like the girl next door. Brown hair that cascades over her shoulders, eyes the colour of warm chocolate, a voluptuous figure. No, she's pretty ordinary, not even terribly pretty. But Jackie has seen the way Letitia flirts, how she seductively arches her brows, how she looks at the oblivious victim of her seduction with coquettishly doughy eyes, making them feel as if they're the only person in the world that matters. She may not have beauty on her side, but she's magnetic, mysterious, alluring and exciting. That's why men can't resist her. And for a brief moment in time, she makes a man feel as if he's all that. Who wouldn't enjoy feeling like that? Everyone wants to feel wanted, needed and adored. But Letitia had cracked the whip in the art of seduction, and had whittled it down to a fine, masterful craft. She was a real witch, that was for sure. No, she's not pretty, I agree, says Jackie, but she's very, very... charming? Yes, she can be charming, alluring. She's going to be at the party tonight and... You don't need to explain, Jackie. I get it. I've been there, remember. I've eaten the same soggy cake, so I absolutely know how you feel. But don't you think in the circumstances, knowing what Letitia is like, you should give Nick another chance? I mean, the woman, she's a witch. She literally casts spells and puts magic love potions into men's drinking glasses. I promise you, I'm not joking. I wouldn't be surprised if she actually really does it. Absolutely not. I'm not going to forgive Nick for this. He knew what she was like. He pulled out the firework from the box with a danger sign attached to it, but he still lit it. He knew its potential dangers and ramifications. And that tells me everything I need to know, Debbie. I was clearly not enough for him. That's a great analogy, Jackie, but I do wish you'd come here tonight to the party. That way you could show Letitia and Nick that what they did to you is water off a duck's back and that you don't actually care a jot. You're missing out on the greatest party in the world because of the two of them. Are they really worth it? You have to ask yourself that. I know what you're saying, and I understand where you're coming from, Debbie. But I can't come to the party. You know you're my best friend, and I would do almost anything for you. But this I can't do, even though we've been planning this for absolute ages. What we would wear and so forth, but I just can't do it. I can't sit back at that party, watching Letitia's smug, self-satisfied, triumphant expression on her face, as she looks at me with that, "I got your man, and he couldn't resist me," kind of look on her face, while Nick spends the whole evening obsequiously begging me to take him back. I need that like a hole in my head, and Nick can be very persuasive when he wants to be, and I'm not going back to him. Not after his betrayal. I'm not. I get it, but I'm so going to miss your company tonight. I really am. And the party, it was going to be so exciting. I mean, we don't get to go to parties like this. This is a really grandiose occasion. I was so looking forward to the two of us driving to the party together in my grandfather's car and having a good old chinwag. I'll have to drive alone now, she says sorrowfully, her voice failing to conceal its bitter disappointment. Jackie feels bad for her friend, of course she does, and disappointed herself that the party she was eager to attend has now gone up in smoke. But wild horses would not persuade her to change her mind and go to that party. She was going to stay the hell away, as it would help her to keep her self-esteem intact, which was hanging on to her heart by a fine silvery thread. Little did Jackie realise that this was the last conversation she would ever have with her best friend Debbie Greentree. She remembers the following morning with a crystal clear clarity, after a long, miserable, insufferable night, spent in bed bawling her eyes out and soaking her pillowcase with her tears of regret. She had always believed Nick was the man she would spend the rest of her life with, so her wistful hopes had been shredded like an old newspaper into hundreds of pieces. It was a Saturday morning, and a beautiful day at that, when Jackie very reluctantly rose out of bed. There was a crack in the curtain of her bedroom window, and a warm sunshine filtered through the bedroom. Its bright shafts danced ebulliently over her duvet cover. It was the warm nudges of the spring sunshine that kissed her face affectionately that made Jackie actually get up. She had intended to barricade herself in the bedroom all day, basking in her lugubrious melancholia, but her plans had suddenly shifted. She'd be damned if Letitia Baker and that tow-rag of a boyfriend of hers would have the privilege of destroying the rest of her weekend. She ambled over to the curtains and drew them back, and stared out vacantly onto the backyard, where she could observe her father standing behind the lawnmower, mowing the green grass. The mower was making that pleasingly comforting humming sound. She noticed her father's expression was very fixed and preoccupied, as he studiously focused on the job at hand, in a meditational stance. She wondered if he liked mowing the grass. He certainly did a fabulous job. The sky was so blue this morning, with white candy cotton clouds. Some of the trees were covered in pearly jewels of fragrant pink blossom. It was such a perfect spring day. The sun was not reticent in magnanimously spraying its sunny showers of warmth over absolutely everything, so that the whole landscape twinkled. Yet the coldness in her heart prevailed, and could not be extinguished. Jackie wondered how the outside world could be so beautiful, when inside her heart was the direct antithesis of this beauty. For her heart was like an ice-cold, desolate alleyway that you'd never want to walk down. Her mouth tasted bitter, as if she'd forgotten to brush her teeth the previous night. So she popped into the bathroom and brushed her teeth rigorously, to rid herself of that horrible stale taste. She glanced at her grey reflection, staring vacantly into the mirror, at the dark circles around her eyes. Goodness, I look dreadful, she thinks. I look more like a ghost than a human being. She quickly threw on a pair of faded jeans and a sweater and ambled down the sweeping staircase towards the kitchen, her heart still heavily afflicted with its current woes, that like a weather report seemed to have a turbulent prognosis for the week ahead, with little hope of any sunny specks. The house seemed steeped in a subdued silence, as if it too was commiserating with her flagging spirits. Jackie dubiously entered the kitchen. She saw her mother sitting at the kitchen table, her face dipped into the pages of the newspaper, while she was drinking a cup of coffee. She looked up at her daughter with a look of concern, dappling her earnest face. "Should you be up, dear? I'm really worried about you. How are you feeling? You look quite dreadful last night. Me and your father are very concerned. I'm wondering if we should call a doctor." "Oh, don't worry about me, Mum." Jackie hadn't wanted to indulge her parents with the shenanigans of her embittered love life. There were some things you didn't share with your parents, and the personal affairs of her heart were for her eyes and ears only. "I'm feeling better," she lied, but nothing could have been further from the truth. "Everything's all right with you and Nick?" asked her mother suddenly. "I was wondering if maybe you were, having issues, perhaps." "Everything's absolutely fine, Mum, with Nick," Jackie says, snapping at her mother. "My love life is none of your business, so keep your nose out of my affairs, will you?" "I'm very sorry, Jackie. I didn't mean to pry or to upset you," says her mother, realising that she's touched a raw nerve, and that her daughter has obviously had some kind of altercation with her boyfriend, otherwise she wouldn't have reacted like that. She sweeps her gaze over Jackie, studying her daughter curiously. Then she rises up from her seat, folding her newspaper and walking over to the range. "I've just made some oatmeal porridge. Would you like some?" "That would be nice," says Jackie, in a subdued tone of voice, sitting down at the kitchen table. She watches her mother scooping porridge in a bowl, and bespeckling it with circles of honey and warm milk, and then she puts it down in front of her. "There you are, dear. Get that into your stomach. It'll make you feel a whole lot better." Jackie had been eating her porridge oats, while her mother continued to read the newspaper, when there'd been an unexpected knock at the front door. Her mother looks up at her daughter in surprise. "Who the hell is that? We're not expecting anyone, are we?" she says. "I better go and answer it, hadn't I?" she says, closing her paper reluctantly and tossing it onto the seat. "Be back in a jiffy, dear," she says, popping an affectionate kiss on Jackie's cheek. "Mind you eat that all up. It'll lift your mood." Jackie can hear her mother opening the door, and the trill of her mother's voice engaged in a conversation with someone. "Oh, come through," she hears her mother say. "Yes, she's eating breakfast." For a moment, Jackie's heart almost leaps. "You've got to be kidding. It's Nick coming to visit her. Please, God, no. He's the last person she wants to see." She hears her mother's feet padding towards the kitchen, followed by a pair of heavy boots. Jackie looks up from her bowl of porridge to see a police officer standing there. He'd accompanied her mother into the kitchen, and both pairs of eyes are now fixed on her. "Here she is, officer." "Sweetheart," her mother pipes, "the officer's here. He'd like to have a word with you." "What about?" she asks, looking up at the officer startled. What on earth would a police officer want with the likes of her? "Please sit down, officer," her mother says, removing her paper from the seat. "Sit over there, please." The officer sits down at the opposite side of the breakfast table from where Jackie is sitting, while her mother brings him a glass of orange juice. "Thank you, ma'am," he says, taking a sip. "Freshly squeezed, just how I like it." Jackie pushes away her half-finished bowl of porridge that no longer seems appetizing. Her appetite has suddenly quite abandoned her. She can perceive by the officer's stern, solemn expression that something is up. It gives her an unsettled sense of foreboding, that something is horribly wrong. And whatever it is, it concerns her. She can feel it into her bones. The officer's brown eyes study Jackie curiously, while he brings out a white paper pad from his pocket and a pen. He looks as if he's about to take down some notes. "I understand that you and Debbie Greentree are the very best of friends, and that last night you and Debbie were going to a party together. But Debbie's grandfather informs me you cancelled at the very last minute. Is that right? Do you mind telling me why that is?" "I wasn't feeling well," says Jackie. "I had a little dispute with my boyfriend about something." She's glad to see that her mother has had the sensitivity to abandon the room, otherwise she might not have been quite so forthcoming to the officer. "What kind of dispute?" he asks. "It's important that you tell me everything. Details are very significant."
"Well, if you really must know, officer, my boyfriend Nick cheated on me with the town floozy. Letitia, I'm sure you must have heard of her before. Everyone knows about her. Well, in my generation at least they do."
"I see. So that's the reason you didn't accompany Debbie to the party. You were upset about the breakup with your boyfriend."
"That's right. I was hardly going to go to a party with that self-satisfied tart hovering around me and my boyfriend telling me it meant nothing and looking so self-satisfied and smug."
"I understand," says the officer, making some notes. Jackie notices he's written down Letitia's name, with a question mark next to it. "Do you know anyone who might have reason to want to hurt your friend, Debbie Greentree?" Jackie gasps, cupping her hand around her mouth in astonishment.
"Are you kidding me, officer? Debbie's the kindest person you could ever wish to meet. She wouldn't ever harm a fly. Has something happened to her?"
"That's what I would like to know. It would seem she has gone missing. She never returned home last night. And more bewildering than that, she never arrived at that party. Her grandfather is very concerned. She was so excited about going to that party. I gather she borrowed his car last night. Has not been seen since. She has a 10-year-old daughter, Daisy, so the grandfather is telling me that Debbie would never abandon her little girl like this."
"No, he's right, officer. Daisy is her entire world. She'd never abandon her child. She had that little girl at 15 years old, you know. She's 25 years old now, but she loves that child."
"So you can think of anywhere that she might have gone last night if she didn't turn up at the party?"
"No, officer, I can't. It makes no sense to me at all. She was so excited, as you were saying, about going to that party. In fact, the two of us discussed it together for ages, what we were going to wear. It was a very prestigious event at a grand venue. Granted, she was sad I wasn't going with her, but I knew she wouldn't miss it for the world. Something's off, officer. She would have gone to that party last night. I know she would." By all accounts, it seemed as if Debbie Greentree had disappeared off the face of the earth, but her body was later recovered when divers discovered her car at the bottom of the lake. A fisherman who had been night fishing at the time had heard something heavy falling into the water and thought nothing of it until he heard about the missing persons report. He wondered if the strange splash he had heard could possibly have been the truck. The police ascertained that it would seem the truck had somehow somersaulted, flipping over the bridge and descending into the watery depths. Debbie Greentree had been unable to escape the confines of the aluminium carcass. She was ruthlessly swallowed by the hungry mouth of the lake, where many insidious secrets may lie buried, sometimes for many generations. It would seem that despite her very best efforts to break through the glass windows of the car under the water, it had become like an unyielding coffin that willfully refused to accommodate her desperate, frantic efforts to escape to safety. Jackie shudders as she thinks of her best friend's last moments. It's a sobering thought to think that she too might have shared that horrifying ending. She wondered if her friend had suffered much. Had she known she was going to die? Of course she had. Jackie could only hope that her last moments had been quick. One night before the funeral, Jackie had woken up in a cold sweat after dreaming about Debbie Greentree, who had appeared to her in her dream, looking directly into her face, pleading with her, "Look after Daisy. Don't forget my little Daisy. You have to help her." The funeral had been a big gathering of poker-faced people from all over town, people who had known or been connected to Debbie in some way. Everyone was dressed in black. Many of the female mourners were wearing black hats and veils, while the men were wearing smart black suits. The lugubrious mood was sombre and Plutonian. Even the grim, cheerless weather was crying the saturnine loss of this dearly beloved departed soul, as it had suddenly capriciously changed so dramatically. The drum rolls of thunder could be heard booming in the distance, and tenebrific grey clouds loomed over the horizon, threatening to spill their gloomy tears onto the mourners. The people clustered together tightly, like miserable chickens in a coop, and gathered around the large hollow in the ground, while the shiny walnut coffin, with its expensive wrought-iron hinges covered in a huge bouquet of white lilies, was lowered into the earthen depths. The sedate priest looked sombre and stony-faced in his long white robe, with its purple ribbon that flanked either side of his collar, and streamed down his chest in a decorative ornate strip of material, dappled with gold designs. "We therefore commit the body of Debbie Greentree to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life." Jackie was standing next to Debbie's grandfather and was holding little Daisy's hand. Mr. Greentree was well along in his age. He walked around on a walking stick, and Jackie noticed he was looking exceedingly frail of late, which was deeply concerning, as he was Daisy's only surviving living relative, and her natural birth father could not be traced. "You must throw a white rose into the coffin now," she whispers to little Daisy. "Your mummy is in heaven singing with the angels. You need to say goodbye." The little girl moves forward, her blue eyes brimming with tears, as she drops a single white rose on the coffin. "Goodbye, Mummy," she says. Suddenly the earth groans. The sound of thunder booms in the background. Lightning scars the sky with an audacious impertinence as yellow, jagged flashes of light flicker through the black clouds like firecrackers, and the heavens open. The rain begins to bolt down so heavily, like a fireman's obstreperous hose, determined to wipe out the flames of a fire. But instead this rain has wiped out the entire funeral. Everyone begins to scatter, like hundreds of rabbits across a warren, back to the safe confines of their burrows. Umbrellas open. People dash quickly back to their trucks, some covering their heads with their jackets, all wishing to escape the huge downpour that knows no restraint, as even the earth is mourning the loss of Debbie Greentree. Jackie's clothes are getting soaked, but she runs up to Daisy, holding her in a warm, loving embrace. "Goodbye, Daisy," she says, kissing the child on the cheek lovingly. "I'm not coming back to the house with you for any snacks. Please tell your grandpa I'm really sorry. I'm just too sad. I can't go back to listen to people talking about how lovely your mum was in life," she says, her eyes filling with tears. "It's too hard for me. Promise me you'll be a good girl for your grandpa." She then looks intently at Daisy. "I want you to promise me, Daisy, if you ever need my help, I'll be here for you no matter what. That's a promise. If you ever need anything, I'll always be here for you. Don't you ever forget that." The little girl nods. Little did Jackie know that she would one day have to honour a promise she'd made a long time ago. 25 years later. It all happened on one cold, inauspicious winter night, when Jackie was about 50 years old. It had been about 25 long years since her best friend Debbie Greentree had passed away. And in that long period of time, so much had happened, so much had changed. Despite everything, she had forgiven Nick for his brief moment of passion all those years ago, with the seductress Letitia, against her own better judgment. Looking back, it would seem that Letitia's promiscuous advances towards her husband, and his inability to refuse them, despite being in a committed relationship with her, had exposed a weakness in his veneer, like a surreptitious leak in the scaffolding of a roof. This contentious issue had persistently plagued Jackie through the course of her marriage, exposing Nick's wandering eye. She had turned a blind eye to it, believing her husband would ultimately grow out of his loutish behaviour. But she'd been wrong about that, as she'd been wrong about so many other things in her life, where she'd made bundles of mistakes, hundreds of poor choices, and a multitude of bad decisions that had cost her dearly. But she had ridden the storms, surfed the waves, and steered her way through the undulating adventures of life. She was still flying high, regardless of some of the fortuitous turbulent jolts and bumps along the way. But then again, whose life is ever plain sailing? We are all going to hit tumultuous weather from time to time. It's part of the rich tapestry of life. It was a year after Debbie Greentree's funeral that she'd married Nick, and the couple had twins, a girl and a boy, that were non-identical. But almost immediately after her grown-up children had finally left home, her marriage to Nick had folded like an old camping chair that was now surplus to requirements, redundant and irrelevant to her current life. Jackie had wanted to end things with Nick 10 years earlier, but raising her kids in a secure, safe environment had been significantly more important to her than anything else.
By all accounts, she had sacrificed much on her children's behalf. But to Jackie, sacrificing for her children was no sacrifice at all, as any mother can appreciate the bond between a mother and her children. Let's just say capsizing the apple cart of their marriage at this crucial, momentous time in the children's development would have upset the twins immeasurably, and she couldn't have done that to them. She had learnt how a broken home would be damaging and soul-destroying to impressionable, ingenuous and suggestible young children, who would often inadvertently blame themselves for the breakup of their parents' relationship, when nothing could have been further from the truth. So her divorce with Nick had gone seamlessly, and she and Nick had remained the very best of friends. Jackie had purchased a remote farmhouse, only an hour and a half's drive away from Portland. She was very pleased to embrace this new exciting chapter in her life that was filled with promise and the sweet fresh fragrance of brand new beginnings, where she could enjoy the rich bouquets that life had to offer, without the challenges of a relationship that constantly beseeched her attention, like the roses in the yard that demanded pruning once a year. Well, that was how Jackie saw it anyway. Relationships necessitated work as far as she was concerned, which meant watering, pruning, feeding, nurturing and loving. Her relationship with Nick had been hard work. For the first time in her life she felt free like a baby eaglet, escaping the confines of its nest, and suddenly realizing that it could fly. It was a liberating feeling that was not for everyone. She had decided she never wanted to marry again. She enjoyed the serene solitude of the countryside. The warm-hearted farmhouse was well off the beaten track, which suited Jackie fine. She often felt she was in the middle of nowhere. She welcomed this new contented lifestyle very happily. When Jackie had first seen the small red bricked unassuming farmhouse, it had been love at first sight. It had large sash windows that had twinkled in the morning with a reflectant light. She could have sworn the place had actually smiled at her, while the windows had winked. She loved the age of her house, as like her it had actually lived, and over the passing of time had absorbed the energy of all the previous residents. It gave the house a cosy, deferential, appeasing, warm glow. She believed houses were like trees. The older they became, the more mellow, improving with time like a maturing wine. She wished she could say the same for herself, but when she looked at her own appearance in the mirror, she didn't always like what she saw staring back at her. She could see that middle-aged had announced its presence rather prominently on her face, like the autumn leaves on an old oak tree. It was like middle age was now saying to her unabashedly, "Here I am," and greeting her with a friendly warmth that she certainly did not want to reciprocate. Let's just say getting older was not something she wanted to welcome with open arms. Indeed, it was something you would chase away, like a pest you wanted to exterminate, for daring to cross the threshold of your body. She knew she'd never been more wise or more comfortable in her own skin. She even liked who she'd become over the last few years. But the outside certainly did not reflect the self-possessed qualities of the inside. She had noticed the efficient arrival of grey hair that was as tenacious as a weed, and no sooner did you cover it up with some brown hair dye, the roots would come bounding back again, begging to be coloured. The constant repetitive dyeing had dried up her hair so much it had become awfully brittle, rather like straw. It was probably good enough to be used on a thatched roof, she thought. Then there was the notorious sprouting of facial hairs on the chin that constantly needed to be plucked. Then, of course, there was her skin that, like an old leather boot, had been worn far too many times and was beginning to look weathered, tired, fatigued, while the wrinkles were creeping around her eyes like the creepers on an old building and could be seen spreading across her forehead and around her mouth. Her once perfectly peachy, flawless skin was beginning to look loose over the jowls. It didn't spring back like it used to when she was younger, and her skin was so much more resilient back then. One of her friends had suggested that to keep the ravages of time at bay, a nip here, a tuck there, might be the answer to all Jackie's problems. But Jackie firmly believed in growing old gracefully. She knew she'd stay the hell away from the surgeon's office. Growing older wasn't that bad, surely. Wrinkles meant you had weathered many storms, overcome hurdles, fallen through crevices, almost jumped off cliff faces, hypothetically speaking. In other words, you had lived, and what was wrong with that? Wrinkles were like proud scars or achievements that you wore on your body. the indelible hallmarks of the victories you had masterfully overcome. It was a dreadful pity that in American culture the ageing process was almost shunned, rather than appreciated or valued, like in other cultures, where the young hung on to the wise, judicious words of older generations, knowing that they would do well to harness the sagacious advice from those that had lived far longer than them, and weathered the intrepid storms in life that they might soon one day have to encounter, and seeking their advice would make their own journeys far less taxing. If Jackie could not halt the ageing process in her own body, she could certainly improve the ageing process in her farmhouse and restore the things that needed a facelift, and she had certainly succeeded in doing just that. She was the surgeon of her own home. She had lifted up old floorboards that needed replacing, and retiled some of the old fireplaces, painted walls, polished floors, re-enamelled windows, replaced broken hinges, cleaned chimneys, and replaced ceilings. It had that cosy, lived-in feeling about it. And all the unpretentious furnishings in her house were elegant but comfortable at the same time, inviting you to collapse on their soft-cushioned seats and to toast your chilled feet by a sumptuous marble fireplace. It was certainly a pleasant evening that night. Jackie sat there reading a book, her cat Mr. Solitaire lying across her lap, while she was caught up in an exciting chapter where the evil man in the story was being murdered by a vigilante. She didn't care about that. She felt reasonably satisfied that the man was getting his just deserts. Jackie had very strong opinions about what was right and what was wrong, although she didn't like killing of any kind. When someone was insanely evil, she could see that their death was justified. It was much better to live in a world where the darkness was eliminated and eradicated, and all that was duplicitously evil gone. It made the world a much safer place, she thought, where your kids could contentedly play down the streets, without your having to worry that someone with the moral perversity of an alley cat would prey upon them. It was no more than exterminating roaches, or eliminating black mould, or an infestation of lice, in her humble opinion. The fire she had made earlier on in the evening was exceedingly pleasant. It was crackling, spitting, folding and curling in the grate. She found it very pleasing to watch, with the bright orange flames dancing around the firewood. She knew the weather was freezing out there. It was winter, and the maple and oak trees in the woodgrove had been stripped of all their leaves. Their naked boughs jutted up in the greyish-blue sky, with a regal impertinence, as if to say, "I still look magnificent without my finery." And they certainly did. They made no apologies for their stark, barren nudity, but were always remarkably comfortable with their seasonal changes. Even in winter, when things became browner, the stone-washed grass lost some of its verdant splendour. There was a rugged beauty of the browner landscape. Some might not agree with her, but Jackie could see it. She could see beauty in everything, and was hoping to eventually see it in her ageing face. But she thought such appreciation would be a long time in coming. Even though it was the beginning of December, when the earth was expecting to be anointed with snow, it had not fallen yet. But she knew when it did, she would be greeted to a white winter wonderland. And out here in her remote farmhouse, the winters were magnificent, provided you kept yourself nice and warm, of course. She was lucky, as her farmhouse was small. A simple fireplace in the living room and the wood-burning stove in the kitchen kept her house deliciously warm throughout the entire winter. There was nothing better than sitting by a fire, staring out at a crisp white world, uncontaminated by human footprints. This evening the farmhouse was peacefully cloaked in a pleasingly tranquil silence that Jackie had grown used to and rather enjoyed. It drowned out the protuberant noises of the world. She liked that very much. It was then that she heard the interfering, obtrusive, unwelcome sound of purring wheels rolling down her driveway. She could hear a truck juddering slightly, until it ground to a halt. The engine was suddenly killed, the headlights punched out, and the truck door opened and closed as someone ambiguous climbed out of the driver's side door, slamming it rather loudly behind them. Jackie knew she never got visitors, not out here in the middle of the night like this. Let's just say her farmhouse was on the edge of a sequestered, inconspicuous dirt road, not well travelled, lonesome, barely ever used. But someone was presumptuously trespassing on her territory now.
She was more than a little flustered about this unpalatable revelation. Who could her mystery visitor be? Jackie never liked spontaneous, unexpected visitors, because what was not expected wasn't always good news. Jackie liked predictability, fixed rendezvous, pre-arranged get-togethers, but not spontaneous surprises. Jackie scrutinised the view outside her kitchen window that overlooked the front yard to see who this fortuitous visitor was, but all she perceived was the dense, tenebrific silhouette of a truck and a faint, obscure figure moving hurriedly towards her door. She could hear feet crunching gravel as they neared their approach. It was so dark and dusky out there. The resistant moonlight seemed shrouded behind some cloud cover, which always seemed to annoyingly happen when you wanted to see something more clearly. Jackie waited attentively and listened. Sure enough, she heard the loud rapping at her front door. Jackie was still wearing her jeans and a warm sweatshirt. She glanced at the time on the mantel above the fireplace. It was 10 o'clock at night. This was a late visitor. Who could it be disturbing her so rudely at this time? 2 hours away from the witching hour. It was ridiculous. Jackie grudgingly moved over to the front door, with a circumspect diffidence. She lifted up a fire poker in one hand and called out, "Who's there?" "It's me," came a demure voice. It was the voice of a woman, and although Jackie did not recognise the voice, she didn't feel threatened, so she opened the door. A young woman was standing in the doorway, wearing a velvety blue coat that clung tightly to her narrow waist. She looked to be about 35 years old, but there was something about her face that looked strikingly familiar. But Jackie couldn't decide what it was. "Hello, Jackie. It's me. Remember you said that if I needed your help, I could come to you." "Sorry," says Jackie, looking at the young woman with a perplexed expression on her face. "Do I know you? You do look awfully familiar, I will admit that. But I'm sorry I can't place you. Have we met before?" "I'm Daisy Greentree, Debbie Greentree's daughter. You were best friends with my mother 25 years ago. I was 10 years old at the time, but I remember you very well. If you recall, they found my mother had drowned in a lake when my grandfather's truck veered off the road. Remember that rickety bridge over the lake that everybody said was a liability? I believe they found another woman's body there as well. She'd been missing for an awful long time. You were at the funeral. It was pouring with rain. The storm was terrible. I remember you made a promise to me that if I ever needed your help, I was to call on you. That day has arrived. I need you to help me now." "You're Daisy Greentree," says Jackie, looking nonplussed. "My, you've grown into quite a lovely-looking young lady. The last time I saw you, you were very young. You look strikingly like your mother." She says, her eyes now filling with tears of nostalgia as she thinks of her beloved old friend that she had sadly lost so tragically all those years ago. "How have you been, Daisy?" "Well, my grandfather died when I was 15, so I was taken to live in a foster home. It was tough, you know. I never did manage to locate my birth father, which was a real bummer. Life hasn't been easy for me. That's why I've turned to you. You're the only person I know that will actually help me." Jackie is filled with guilt when she hears this startling revelation. She feels dreadful that she had not remained in touch with Debbie Greentree's daughter all these years. Why had she been so caught up in herself and her family that she'd not thought to contact the young girl, who had now ended up at the mercy of social services? She recalls how Debbie had appeared to her in a dream, begging her to take care of little Daisy. She finds herself flushing with the shame of her apathy. "Please come in, Daisy," she says. "Thank you," says the young woman, removing her coat and hanging it on the hook in the hall. Jackie leads Daisy into the living room and gestures for her to sit by the fire. But Daisy, hungry for warmth, stands by the fire, stretching her fingers towards the flames. "Oh, this fire of yours is so blissful. I felt as if my fingers were about to drop off, they were so numb. But now I'm much warmer, thanks to your amazing fire." She glances around at the living room with an approving appreciation. "You've got taste, Jackie. Why am I not surprised? Your farmhouse has that lived-in feeling about it.
It's not like some of these places where you daren't sit on the couch because it's so pretentious, and the place is so perfect you're scared that by merely sitting on something you're going to put a mark on it. One of the foster homes I lived in was exactly like that. The family kept all their furniture wrapped in cellophane in order to preserve it, so we had to sit on plastic couches all the time. It was terribly unpleasant. The plastic would stick to the back of my legs. It would be so sweaty. That was the worst foster home I ever lived in. The mother was obsessed with cleanliness. We weren't allowed to wear shoes in the house. You'd wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning to the wife hoovering the furniture. It would be so disturbing. The noise would drive me bonkers. In the end, her husband could not take her incessant cleaning any more, so they split up. He told his solicitor he was filing for divorce as his wife was addicted to bleach. I think he took it quite literally. She laughs a pretty musical laugh. I think he thought she was glugging the stuff back like Kool-Aid. Oh dear, Daisy. That was no way to live. I just wish you'd contacted me sooner, I really do. I would have been more than happy for you to move in with us, become part of our family. I know the twins would have loved an older sister to look up to like you. So how can I help you, Daisy? If you're looking for somewhere to stay, you're more than welcome to stay here with me. How did you find me? Oh, that was easy enough. I asked Pastor Bob if he knew where you lived. He gave me your daughter's telephone number. She gave me your new address. When I told your daughter I was Debbie Greentree's daughter, they knew who I was at once, so they didn't hesitate to give me all your details. That's right, my daughter and son. They're non-identical twins, you know. They knew all about Debbie growing up. I talked about her an awful lot, even though she died a long time ago now. It feels almost as if it happened yesterday. The emotions are still raw. You never get over something like that. Do you remember your promise to me that day, when it was pouring with rain at the funeral? Of course I do, Daisy. Well, I need your help now. I've no one else to turn to, and I'm going to hold you to that promise. Can you guarantee me your discretion? It's incredibly important. Of course I'll help. What is it, Daisy? I've killed my boyfriend. He's lying dead in the back of my truck. I need you to help me hide the evidence. I thought we could bury him on your farm somewhere, burn up my car, so there's no link between me and his disappearance. He's from Poland, so no one knows about him. He's been working as an assistant chef at a local hotel. If he goes missing, people will think he returned to Poland. He's also estranged from his parents. He had a massive fallout with them, so they won't be worried about him either. I wouldn't embroil you in all this, but I can't go to prison. I just can't. I wouldn't survive in a place like that. For a moment, Jackie thinks she's caught up in the most horrifying, surreal nightmare. You killed your boyfriend, she says, looking at Daisy in horror, as if her friend's daughter has suddenly become a callous monster. Had she heard right? Is this young girl, Daisy, expecting her to duplicitously cover up a murder? She can't be expected to help her late friend's daughter like this. She could be accused of assisting in covering up a crime. And Jackie does not want to end up locked up in a prison cell for something she did not do. But then again, she does not want to turn her back on her best friend's daughter either. What the hell is she supposed to do about this? Daisy nods. Tears stream down her face. Don't look at me like that, Jackie. I'm not a monster. I'm not. Believe me. Marson is the monster. He was the monster in our relationship. She pulls up her sleeves and shows me some black bruises on her arms. Jackie gets up to examine the bruises. He did this to you? Why on earth did you not tell the police about this? Why would you stay with a man like this? You're asking for trouble. Because I loved him, that's why. I thought he would change. You see, he isn't always a monster. People like that aren't always monsters. Most of the time he was sweet. He was good to me. He made me feel so happy. But then there were other times he would lose it, get so violently angry. That's when he'd hurt me. The next day he was so apologetic. He'd say he was so sorry about what happened, that he didn't mean it, and I was his entire world. And he didn't know what had possessed him to hurt me like that, and that he'd never ever do it again. But you know what, Jackie? The tragedy is he always did.
It was like I was in a relationship with a Jekyll and Hyde type personality. Most of the time, Marson was like a clear sunny day. But when the thunderclouds came out, you had to be so careful, because you knew he might strike you down with his lightning temper. And when he was like that, Jackie, I was so terrified of him, so terrified. Oh dear, says Jackie, looking at Daisy with empathy. You were in love with one part of him, but the other part of him you tried to bury away. Pretend it wasn't there. If he was so loving most of the time, it was easy to overlook the times he was violent. It's got to be like walking on eggshells all the time, not knowing when he's going to throw a hissy fit. Something like that. Tell me what happened from the very beginning. Well, we were in the supermarket together one day. You see, I work as a waitress at the local hotel. You see, that's how we actually met. Marson assists the head chef there. He's an excellent cook. For a long time he thought I had a thing for one of the managers at the hotel, a man called Brian Raper. There'd been nothing going on between the two of us. Brian and I were just good friends that had a similar sense of humour. But try telling that to Marson. He was so jealous. Anyway, I serendipitously bump into Brian when putting some chips into the trolley at the supermarket. Marson had gone off to pick up some cheeses at the counter. Brian and I were talking together. He told me some funny jokes. What was it he said? Oh, yes, cosmetic surgery used to be a taboo subject. Now you can talk about Botox and no one raises an eyebrow. And what was the other one he said? What does a painter do when he's cold? He puts on another coat. Stuff like that. Brian's always got a fabulous joke up his sleeve. So I was naturally laughing. Let's just say I think he can pick up Marson's jealousy, because Marson is so possessive of me. Anyway, Marson reappears from the cheese counter. He physically scowls when he sees us laughing together. He has the cheeses in his hands, which he lowers into our trolley, and he gives Brian a scathing look. Brian, sensing the hostility from Marson, says, How you doing, Marson? Very good to see you, bro. And he quickly makes an excuse, glances at his cell phone and says, Golly, is that the time? I must go. I'm in a dreadful hurry. He bids me goodbye, nods politely, and scuttles away guiltily. Even though he had nothing to feel guilty about whatsoever, but Marson can make you feel like that. He certainly gave Brian a killer look. And when I looked at his face at the supermarket, it had grown as black as thunder. I was scared even before we returned home that day. I didn't even want to get out of the truck. I knew what awaited me when we got into the apartment. Just like overcast weather, his face gave me that forewarning. The bad weather was coming my way, storm clouds, lightning, the works. You know the score. Marson was furiously jealous. He beat me up, accusing me of all sorts, and of clandestinely having an affair with Brian behind his back. I told him it was nonsense, but he absolutely refused to listen. I thought he was going to kill me when he had his hands clasped around my neck, and he began to squeeze. His eyes just suddenly became as black as coal. I was gasping for breath, telling him to stop, and he had me pinned against the wall, right next to the telephone table. So I reached out to grab the heavy statue of the Buddha, and I thrashed it across his head as hard as I could. He fell back onto the ground and stopped moving. I ran over to him. I tried to wake him up. I tried to find a pulse, but I knew he was dead. So I managed to drag him to my truck, hauling him into the back. I nearly died in the process of physical exhaustion. I don't even know how I managed to lift him up, because he's quite heavy. But that's exactly what happened. I don't want to go down for this. Marson was the antagonizer, not me. I was fighting back, but things went so horribly wrong. And now I'm in such a dreadful mess, such a screw-up. This is the sort of thing that happens in movies, but not in real life, and not to people like me. Well, sweetheart, it was self-defense. You were defending yourself. You tell the police what you told me, and all will be well. Are you kidding me, Jackie? You do know what will happen. I'll be taken to prison for a couple of years, before there's even a court case. And even then, there are no guarantees that I'll even get off. I can't afford to take that risk. I don't want to spend a single day in a prison. You hear of cases of people who aren't guilty, going down for years and years. Do you know, Jackie, if you accidentally hit someone who runs out into the road, and you got a whisper of alcohol on your breath, You can go down for 20 years. It happened to one of the waitresses I work with. Her sister. She tried to take her life in prison. She can't hack it there. You have to help me, Jackie. I can't spend a single day in a prison cell. I just can't, and I won't survive. I promise you, Jackie, I couldn't cope. Not in that kind of environment. I would lose it.
I wish you wouldn't get so upset, Daisy. I want to help you, and I believe every word you've told me. I'm sure you won't go to prison. It definitely is self-defense, and we can get you the very best lawyer, and I'm happy to do that for you. And even if there is a court case, it'll definitely go your way. There isn't a juror in the land that wouldn't believe your account. Really? Are you kidding, Jackie? For one so mature, you're terribly naive. Sometimes those lawyers are so convincing. They can artfully persuade a jury to free a guilty man and an innocent person to go to jail. If they can proficiently persuade the jury with their adroit silver tongue, then you're in trouble. Especially if they're against you. Your fate is doomed. Everyone knows the judicial system is corrupt. Most people don't know the side of Marson I did. I'm sure they'd find people to testify against me, say that Marson couldn't hurt a fly, and that he was such a nice person. They'd possibly paint me in an unfavourable light. I can't take that risk, Jackie. I could be sent down for a very long time. No one knew the dark side of Marson like I did. But you've got bruises to prove what he did to you. That's hearsay, Jackie. I could have bruised myself. You've only got my word for it. They could say I made it all up. You never know. You would have done anything for my mother, would you not, Jackie? Jackie nods. Of course I would have done anything for your mother. If it was her begging you to help me cover this up, would you have helped her do it? Jackie thinks about this for a moment. Well, if there was a hint of her going to jail for something like this, I would definitely help her cover it up. Don't you see? You're helping my mother when you help me. I'm her daughter, and you did tell me that if there was anything I need, you would help me. And I'm here. You made a promise to me, Jackie. Now you need to fulfill that promise. Very well, I'll help you. I hope the hell I know what I'm doing. What are you going to say at work about Marson? I'll say he returned home to Poland because he got very homesick. Don't you see, no one will suspect a single thing. But what about this Brian character? Won't he think it strange that you and Marson are no longer together? I doubt it. I'll say we split up. So he went back to Poland. There was nothing left for him in America anymore. I know Brian would believe that. I think we should do this now, says Jackie, before I change my mind. Are you up to it? It's cold and dark outside. But I'll get some shovels and some lemonade. Digging is thirsty work. I just want to examine the body. Just make sure he's really dead. He's dead, said Daisy. I checked. When Jackie opened the trunk of Daisy's car, she wasn't prepared for what she would see. She observed the crumpled remains of a deceased corpse of a young man who was still warm. She was mortified. It was like she was being flung in the middle of a surreal nightmare. Was this really happening? Was she going to help cover up a death? Get a grip, she told herself. You're doing this for Daisy, and for her mother, Debbie Greentree. I failed to help Daisy earlier on in her life, and I'll be damned if I don't help her now. Debbie would be devastated if Daisy had to spend a single night in jail, let alone years. And Daisy was right. How could you be sure things would go in her way in a court of law? Things could become twisted and manipulated by a skillful lawyer who could artfully persuade a jury that Daisy was a vindictive, vile person that deserved to rot away in a prison cell. No, she couldn't let this happen to her best friend's daughter. Not on your Nellie. The weather was freezing. It was furiously biting down to bone and sinew. The two women wrap up warmly, with gloves and headscarves, and Daisy drives her land cruiser across the grassy terrain to the edge of a sprawling woodgrove that fringes an alpine meadow. Are you ready? Says Jackie. If we're going to do this, it's not too late to change your mind, Daisy. But once we've buried the body in the ground, it's too late then. Do you understand what I'm saying? No, we're going to do this, says Daisy. There is no other way. The two women stealthily climb out of the land cruiser, closing their doors quietly behind them. There is an icy cold breeze whistling through the trees, nudging their cheeks. Everything is tenebrously dark. The moonlight has slipped behind the shadows, as if turning a blind eye to what the women are doing tonight. The stars have lost their sparkle. They seem dusted by a veil of cloud cover. Jackie's hands, even though they're covered by fleece-lined gloves, feel like ice-cold sticks, and when she breathes out, her breath looks like a vapour from the steam of a kettle. The two women open up the back of the trunk and manage to drop the crumpled body from the trunk to the canvas taupine below. Then they both drag it across the ground so that it slides over the earthen floor very easily. "Where are we going to bury him?" asked Daisy. "I think under that oak tree over there," says Jackie. "It's still young. It's got lots of growing to do. When its roots get more mature, they'll eat up the corpse like bone meal." "You think so?" asked Daisy. "I do," says Jackie. The frozen women begin to dig up the ground. It's exhausting, laborious work. The ground is unyielding and not exactly soft, but there is a saving grace. The physical exertion is making them both warm. The forest is very quiet and subdued. Even the trees appear muted in their graceful repose, as if they are soundlessly watching the two women's every move. The unassuming witnesses of a secret that the two women hope will be clandestinely hidden for many centuries, and better still, never found out. All you can hear are the airy, ghostly sounds of a wind whistling through the trees. Jackie cannot shake the ominous, unsettling feeling that they're being watched by curiously inquisitive, predatory eyes. She reminds herself that they're wild animals in the forest, and anything could have observed them. A lone fox, perhaps. A couple of raccoons. She tells herself she feels very conspicuous and self-conscious because a big part of her knows that what she's doing is covering up a death to protect her best friend's daughter. That's why she's feeling like this. If you had asked her even a week ago if she was capable of covering up somebody else's deadly mistake, would she have been capable of doing this? She would have unequivocally said no. But this is different, very different. This is personal. And Jackie will do anything for her old friend Debbie Greentree. Anything. "I'm exhausted," says Daisy. "Let's take a break." The women walk over the earthen floor back to the truck, and they comfortably sit in the front seats, drinking back bottles of icy-cold lemonade. Their breathing is laboured, their faces flushed, their hands still icy and numb. "Phew, that's exhausting work," says Jackie. "I'm so fatigued. But we can't stop now. We have to keep pushing on. We've got to finish what we started. I think the sooner we've done what we've set out to do, the sooner we can relax." "Thanks, Jackie," says Daisy, reaching out to give the woman a squeeze. "I so appreciate your help." "Remind me not to go promising people stuff," says Jackie, joking. "You might be asked to do something that crosses the boundaries of what you deem as comfortable. Come on, let's get back to work, shall we?" The two women climb out of their truck rather reluctantly, walking through the trees, stopping dead in their tracks. They see someone leaning over the deceased corpse. The first thought that comes bounding into Jackie's head is, "Oh my God, we've been caught red-handed. Someone has found out what we've done. Me and Daisy, we're going to go down for this." The man who is examining the corpse is wearing the thickest winter coat. What the hell is he doing in her woodgrove anyway? Where did he come from? She lives in a remote area. Where did this random stranger just suddenly appear from? She can see the man's hand slapping the cheeks of the dead corpse, and then he stands up to face the both of them, and to their absolute horror, they realise that this is not a man, but a Bigfoot. Jackie had heard stories of the cryptid creatures before, but had never given the stories much credibility. She believed that they were the fabrications of an overactive imagination that turns a bear encounter into a Bigfoot, but she is in no doubt what she's seeing now. She can hear Daisy is audibly gasping, and even though she's not looking at Daisy's expression, she is profoundly aware that the woman is astonished by what she's seeing. The Bigfoot is over 8 foot tall, female with floppy breasts and a muscular body, devoid of even an inch of fat. She is robust and powerful looking, and Jackie thinks she could easily weigh 700 pounds, despite her leanness, as her body is remarkably well built, and her shoulders are absolutely enormous. The creature is covered in long flowing hair that Jackie thinks is an inky black colour, but you can't be sure in the dark. She possesses an arch-shaped head
that is low slung on her shoulders, to such an extent it would be easy to assume that she hadn't got a neck, but that would be wrong. The creature has a very short, stout, but stocky neck, and a face so remarkably human, it had taken Jackie completely off guard. Are not Bigfoot supposed to have primate characteristics, she thinks? This creature certainly doesn't, unless of course you count the overlong arms and the hair. Jackie tries to think what the face reminds her of, and then she remembers she has a picture of an Indian warrior in a headdress on her coffee table in the living room. Oh my God, her face looks exactly like that. It has such a noble, regal quality about it, a wizened look on her face that makes you think she's very intelligent. The creature is beckoning to the two women, pointing to the body. She's chattering excitedly, backwards and forwards to them. There is nothing aggressive or threatening about her, so the two women follow the creature. The Bigfoot bends down and slaps the face of the corpse. Marson responds by grumbling and groaning. Oh my word, he's alive, he's alive. Jackie and Daisy look at each other in bewilderment. They realise they came this close to burying Marson alive. The Bigfoot is chattering excitedly to them. Jackie gets the profound sense that the creature is as thrilled as they are, that the dead body that they were about to bury has miraculously returned to life. The Bigfoot lifts up the body without even being asked, and follows the woman back to the car, popping Marson's body on the back seat. The creature seems hell-bent on helping the two women, whom she realises are puny and weak, so she follows them as they drive back to the farmhouse. When Jackie opens the trunk of the car, the Bigfoot is standing there, almost offering her services, and Jackie indicates for the creature to take the body of Marson up the stairs to the spare bedroom. The Bigfoot seems to understand everything she's saying, and dutifully pops Marson on the bed. "Thank you," says Jackie. "Thank you." The benevolent, kind-hearted Bigfoot nods at Jackie, almost as if she's smiling at her, and then she bounds down the steps, glides out of the house, almost floating back into the forest, with a grace that leaves the two confounded women completely speechless. Bloody hell! Did that actually just happen? Did we just meet a Bigfoot who helped us? And is Marson really alive? Did that happen? I feel as if I'm in some kind of parallel universe. To cut a long story short, Jackie told me and my twin sister this incredulous story, in the strictest of confidence. It would seem that she and Daisy took care of Marson until he fully recovered. It was fortunate he seemed to have no memory of being whacked over the head by a statue, although he did confess he had a dream that a Bigfoot had been slapping him on the face, telling him to wake up. It was my mother, Jackie, who informed Marson that he had taken a tumble and fallen over some steps, hitting his head, which was why he was badly concussed. Needless to say, Daisy and Marson never rekindled their relationship, and in the end he did return to Poland, and I gather he's married with children of his own. My mother now lives with Daisy in the red-bricked farmhouse, and they've started growing crops on their land, which they sell at the farmer's market. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the unfavourable night was ominous, as the young man drove towards the old weathered-looking farmhouse, in his father's slightly beat-up second-hand truck, that had almost certainly seen better days. It was a pity that the truck didn't drive quietly. The doors tended to rattle and shake precariously, and it certainly didn't help driving down a driveway lined with gravel, where the rubber tyres would make that annoying crunching sound. It would seem the battered old truck, that was good only for the knacker's yard, would violently shake, wobble and squeak, as it trudged awkwardly over the rough country roads, like a prehistoric piece of barely operable farming machinery, making no apologies for the clattering, juddering noise it made. The noise was similar to the sound you hear on a wedding car, with just married splashed on the back windscreen, and ribbons of metal cans dragging behind it, clattering loudly against the asphalt road. Tonight the antique, weather-beaten, rusted old truck could not afford to be noisy. As if the young man woke up the sleeping household, he could potentially be in grievous trouble. Let's just say even his freedoms, everything he'd worked so hard for all his life, could be in grievous jeopardy. The old farmhouse was unremarkable. but distinctive, with its crooked chimneys and the slightly battered-looking roof, along with the bleached, tired-out blue shutters. If you hadn't known better, you might have thought a very unprofessional builder had laid the foundations of the building, as the walls were not perfectly straight, and everything was slightly out of alignment, but in a strange way its imperfections and slightly higgledy-piggledy stone walls gave the house oodles of character. At dusk, all its conspicuous imperfections were masterfully veiled and obscured. The stone house was all but a dark silhouette, as only a hint of bashful moonlight peeked curiously through the sky. The stars seemed somewhat dull and subdued in their parsimonious offerings, as if the sparkling night performers had suddenly decided to cancel their flamboyant, twinkling, star-studded performance for the evening. The lack of illumination made everything seem inauspicious, as the young man parked his truck in an isolated, ambiguous, grassy clearing, clandestinely cloaked behind the mantle of the lofty trees, so that no one would hear or see his clandestine, furtive approach. He killed the engine, punching out the headlights, and his truck shuddered until it was finally out cold. The long-legged, gangly silhouettes of the trees were like prodigious giants, with gnarled, outstretched arms that moved in the slight breeze. For a moment the young man almost felt as if the trees were whispering about him, possibly even to him. Maybe they were warning him, telling him not to do what he was about to do. But the young man could not be discouraged on his mission. For a moment he sat in his truck, staring out at the inky night. The whole countryside was nebulous, vague. The definitive details of the farm buildings and the old stable block were swallowed up by the pervasive blanket of caliginous twilight, swathed the whole valley in its sweeping shadows. It seemed strange for the young man to be out this late at night, or early in the morning if you like. He was not that well acquainted with the darkness. As a kid he'd never been able to sleep comfortably without a night light on. Slowly but surely he tentatively climbed out of his truck, barely shutting the door behind him, to avoid making any noise. In a trice he became profoundly aware of the slightest sounds, knowing full well that any noise could be his greatest undoing and potentially lead to disastrous consequences that he did not want to entertain. He was still a far distance away from the farmhouse, but he navigated his way easily through the knee-high grass that brushed against his pants, the moisture of the cold morning dew lathering his ankles with its wet touch. For a moment he stood still to get a full sense of his bearings, as he knew the layout of the land very well and the best shortcut to the farmhouse. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. He could hear the crickets and frogs singing their cheerful choruses and feel the soft wind beating against his skin, like a cool, refreshing hand caressing his face. It offered his anxious heart a light reprieve from its thunderous beats. It was almost as if the wind, like a matriarch figure of companionship, had given him that much-needed encouraging nudge, and said, "Go on, son. You know you can do it." The young man could hear the roar of the obstreperous water from the spirited stream that casually meandered through the woodgrove on the right-hand side of the valley, and its crashing sounds helped to mask the noise of his rubber boots pressing against the dew-laden grass. For a moment he continued to stand very still. He looked behind him. He couldn't shake off this nagging feeling that he wasn't alone. He was certain he could sense a ponderous presence, as if something of quite a sizable stature and girth was watching him from behind the trees. Why did he feel so saliently conspicuous tonight, as if everything and everyone knew exactly what he was doing? It was the guilt speaking, he told himself. This is what guilt is like. It's a feeling of being watched all the time, a profound sense that everybody knows your dirty secret, that you are wearing like a loud T-shirt with the big blasting, booming words, "I did it," sprawled over the front. The young man steered his way towards the farmhouse, sometimes breaking into a light jog. He sensed something was moving behind him, as if he was being followed. This was all he needed. He pulled out his little torch from the top pocket of his plaid jacket and allowed the invasive light to poke intrusively between the trees that fringed the outer perimeters of the sprawling meadow. For a second, he was certain he'd seen something moving, and had fleetingly discerned a large silhouette, hiding behind a sizable tree trunk. But then, when he flashed his light over the area that had arrested his attention, nothing was there, only a tree branch which seemed to be airily seesawing up and down on its own, as if someone had pushed it, but nothing was there. It must have been a shadow, he told himself persuasively. Yet the baleful, airy feeling of being watched and surreptitiously stalked persisted. The young man squinted through the crepuscular gloom to see if he could see any further sign of movement. The trouble was it was so damn dark. He thought he could barely see a thing, so keeping his torchlight on might easily draw attention to himself. He wasn't prepared to take any risks tonight, as one wrong move could seriously compromise his success. Slowly but surely, he covertly moved like a ghostly spectre through the grass, his jog turning into a sprint. But he judiciously avoided the gravel paths, and cunningly took a right-hand turn to the backyard, ambling down the side of the farmhouse, towards the bright red kitchen door. The farmhouse stared at him blankly, with a pensive detachment. The windows were blacked out by heavy block-out curtains that had been fastidiously drawn. Everything was swaddled in a hushed quietude, as if the house itself was fast asleep. It was obvious to the young man that no one was up and about. No lights were on in the house, with the exception of one outside light that remained on throughout the evening. He was satisfied there was no sign of movement, almost as if the night itself was holding its breath. The young man could not remember having been more afraid, as he was right now. Indeed, he'd never known fear like this. In truth, his pounding heart had become like a fist hammering his chest violently from the inside, so that it physically vibrated. His guts were tied up into hundreds and hundreds of knots. It would be so easy for him to turn around and run all the way back to his truck, to the safe confines of his parents' home. That would certainly be the easy way out, and a coward's approach. He knew he was no coward. There was too much for him to lose if he didn't do the right thing. There was so much at stake here, everything at stake. Sometimes a man's got to do what a man's got to do. Suffice to say, taking a risk for the greater good was a price worth paying, even if the ultimate cost was heavy. This was a no-brainer, in his humble opinion. He contemplated the male lions he'd been watching on Animal Planet moments before. He had downloaded the video, which he'd watched again and again, to give him inspiration. By all accounts, the courage and intrepid ballsiness of these gallant male cats rubbed off on him exponentially, especially when he needed to do something that required raw guts and steel nerve. Certainly watching the fortitude, the pluckiness, the gutsy audacity of a male lion helped to conquer the little man inside of himself, bring out the intransigent knight that was willingly to doggedly fight to the death, if needs must. It was the single-minded bravery of those lions that helped him to get into the truck tonight, to drive all the way here. If they could face their fears, then so could he. There was no going back from this. You couldn't unwrite the script, nor could you backtrack on your actions. The young man's long, slender fingers trembled. His hands grabbed hold of the kitchen door. The cold metal was icy to the touch, almost giving him an electric shock. He sneakily pushed the handle down, knowing it would open. It didn't disappoint, but it scraped on its rusty hinges. Like everything in this house, it was old, shabby, worn out and tired. The young man ambled discreetly across the old linoleum floor, and he covertly tiptoed through the kitchen, into the living room, down the passage towards the foot of the staircase. For a second he held his breath, almost as if he was afraid someone might actually hear his breathing. He stood at the base of the staircase and listened for any signs of life or movement. A stray cough, a faint cry, a mumbling voice. But nothing flinched in the silence. Everything was still. For a second he nearly had a heart attack when a warm body began rubbing against his legs, purring like a little steam engine. His eyes dropped to his feet. It was the household-friendly Tabby, that seemed quite pleased that someone was up and about at this god-forsaken unfriendly hour. It was demanding attention that the young man could not afford to give. It rubbed its sleek coat against his legs again and again. He reached out with an unsteady hand to pat the cat affectionately, scratching it briefly under the chin. It rolled over on its back, happily showing off its white underbelly and staring at him through his green eyes. The young man whispered into its ears, "Maybe next time." He then climbed the creaking staircase, lined with an old frayed ribbon of carpet that may well have been as fossilized and outmoded as the house itself. He took 2 steps at a time up the staircase that seemed inordinately loud as he ascended to the 2nd floor, where the family was fast asleep. The steps protested, they groaned and squeaked, but he tried his best to be as noiseless as possible. The incorrigible cat was still purring profusely, trailing behind him, determined to get more attention from the young man. Another tickle under the chin, or a rub on the stomach, would go down very nicely indeed. The man stood on the landing, pinpointing his attention to one door at the end of the long passage, where a little Pooh Bear silhouette was dangling on the outside handle of the door. He quietly padded past a couple of bedroom doors that were only open by a little crack, from where he could hear the rhythmic rise and fall of somebody's breathing, accompanied by the laboured nasal snores from the man of the house. He knew one wrong move, and the entire household would be awakened. He didn't want to face the wrath of the disagreeable Zachariah Miller, who was the most obnoxious, disagreeable man he'd ever had the pleasure to meet. He ruled his family with a rod of iron, or like the German Gestapo. It was his way or the highway, and everyone surrendered to his demands, intimidated by his loud, aggressive bark, subdued by his hostile, condescending manner. Let's just say if Zachariah caught the young man snooping around his house, he was quite sure he'd end up with a bullet in the side of his head, would likely find himself buried under the patio of their home, as Zachariah operated according to his own set of rules, and the dictates of the law worried him little. The young man stood at the end of the passage, clandestinely pushing open the door of the nursery, and was surprised that the door did not squeak or screech in protest. In a trice, his rapid breathing became laboured. His pounding heartbeat increased in intensity. Indeed, it became so loud, it was the only sound he could actually hear. He moved cautiously towards the bassinet, his body trembling like a jelly. The adrenaline coursed through his veins, burning them like a fiery red-hot caustic acid. The bassinet was parked in the middle of the room, like an island surrounded by an ocean of oakwood flooring. It was positioned directly opposite the window, where a tiny glimmer of moonlight peeked through the curtains, offering him a faint enough illumination to see what needed to be seen, without stumbling awkwardly around in the darkness like a blind man. The room smelled pleasantly agreeable, of baby powder, soap and lavender. He noticed a trolley set up against the side of the room, lined with a baby bath and a plethora of bath products. And on one wall were shelves covered with teddy bears and all kinds of toys. Moments later he bent over the tiny sleeping form, lying comfortably swaddled in a white blanket. He scooped out the sleeping child into his arms, terrified he might wake him up. Tiny fingers prodded into his. The child gurgled. Big blue eyes opened up to stare into his, and for a brief second the child let out a little chuckle. A fingernail of dread skirted up the young man's spine, as the cat jumped into the crib very suddenly, still purring incessantly, determined to get as much attention as the sleeping toddler. "I've got to do this," the young man told himself firmly, grabbing the child in his arms, his pulse racing, his adrenaline screaming. "You're coming with me, little one," he said, "even if it means I go to jail for a very long time." The cat meowed in protest as the young man hurriedly scurried away. It was clear the cat would have appreciated a stomach rub, a nice scratch under the chin, but it seemed that this time the nighttime visitor was otherwise preoccupied, which was such a bummer for the disappointed cat. With the toddler now in his arms, the man with the stealth of a black leopard and the cunning of a fox sneaked furtively down the passageway, towards the staircase, back through the living room, finally into the kitchen. He could hear the sound of the cat mewing, padding behind him, following him everywhere he went, occasionally meowing, which is not what the young man wanted to hear. Well, not now, anyway. In a trice he speedily scooted soundlessly towards the kitchen door, slipping it open and closing it behind him discreetly. The stirring child began to twist in his arms, but he hurriedly rocketed through the meadow as fast as a March hare, his heart pounding, his head glancing over his shoulders to check that no one was following him. But the stoic farmhouse seemed locked in a deep trance-like sleep. Before long, the little toddler was strapped in a baby seat next to the driver's seat in the truck. The clanking, crashing sound of the battered truck could be heard stealing away in the night, when all that was left was the whispering trees, the cool breeze, and an oblivious sleeping household, soon to awaken to a bassinet that contained a sleeping tabby. But the child would be gone. Officer Murray's account. I had been called over to the Zachariah Miller farmhouse after the report of a missing toddler had come to my attention. I was no stranger to the likes of Zachariah Miller, who had a notoriously bad reputation in our hometown for being a very disagreeable, cantankerous character. And if there was a drunken brawl or an intoxicated altercation going on, you could bet your bottom dollar Zachariah Miller was lightly behind it. I had noticed that when Zachariah entered a local bar, it was like the Red Sea would part and divide. The locals would shrink away, giving the man all the space he needed. The bar manager would give Zachariah exclusive, immediate service, rather like a celebrity of note. I think people were genuinely afraid of the man, especially after a local man called Wayne had shortly gone missing after a physical altercation with Zachariah Miller. Try as we might to find any evidence to point to Zachariah being behind the missing man's disappearance, it had been like looking for a needle in a haystack, so the man could not be convicted or charged without the benefit of any evidence. Indeed, he may not have done anything to the likes of Wayne, but the coincidences were remarkable, and I was not a man that believed in coincidences. I was surprised that Zachariah had called me out to his farmhouse, for the man had absolutely no respect for the police, regarded us like the roaches he would personally like to exterminate. Men like him would rather drink their own cow's urine than deal with the likes of the police. Yet on this occasion Zachariah had genuinely sounded concerned about the whereabouts of his grandchild, and had obsequiously urged us to come at once. So now I was on my merry way to visit the most disliked person in our town. I could count on my hand over a dozen times when Zachariah had spent the latter part of the evening sobering up in a police cell, after beating up one of the townsfolk, and causing more often than not a bloody nose. Then there were the scattering of times when I'd been called over to the house due to a 911 call from the man's frightened daughter Greta, who would tell us her mother had been beaten up by her father, and despite sustaining a broken rib, a broken jaw, a broken ankle, not to mention a plethora of black bruises, Mrs. Miller refused to file any charges against her husband. I couldn't understand women like her. Believe me, I've met many like her in my years as a police officer, some whose naivety and unwillingness to file charges against their abusive husbands has cost them their lives in the end. I was worried Mrs. Miller might end up just like one of them. Zachariah was one of those men that if you pushed him too far, he might just snap. I felt certain that Mrs. Miller was in danger. Of course, I'd warned her about this numerous times, told her it was in her best interest to file a report against her husband. But the stubborn woman was unwaveringly resolute that she could never ever betray the man she'd married, even when he'd physically hurt her from time to time. I knew both mother and daughter were terribly afraid of Zachariah's temperamental mood swings, and yet they steadfastly remained under his roof, as loyal, devoted members of the family. It was a beautiful crisp morning. It was autumn in Ohio. The countryside was written in the atmosphere of a poem, as everything was resplendently ablaze, with a plethora of golden colours, from the sycamore and cottonwood trees, along with the rich red hue seen in the Ohio buckeye trees, and the bright orange from the maples. The landscape had never been more magnificent. The soft morning sunshine was soothingly mellow. The Miller farmhouse with its wood and stone walls looked a little unkept, as if it hadn't had a makeover in many years. But in a strange way the old, rather uneven, asymmetrical stone house, with its crooked chimneys, peeling paint on the wooden windows, and washed-out blue shutters, with its blazingly obvious imperfections, seemed almost sculptural against some of the very curvaceous trees of the woodgrove. In truth, the interesting brown shades of the stones complemented the greens and golds and reds of the trees, now boasting their full flush of colour. I drove down the gravel driveway, as pebbles pinged doggedly against the undercarriage of my truck. When I arrived at the farmhouse, I could see two wilted, disquieted faces of both mother and daughter, peering down at me curiously from the second-story window. The door of the farmhouse flung open abruptly, and a man who would play the part of Scrooge to perfection in the Christmas Carol ambled out of the house, wearing a sour expression on his face. Indeed, it was so bitter it could easily curdle milk and turn cream sour. The man with his Germanic bullish face and full head of wild, unkept brown curls came thundering towards me with an aggressive stance that took me aback. He reminded me of a charging dog running after a toy poodle that he wanted to bite. The very sight of him ruffled my feathers. "What took you so long, Officer Murray?" he almost snarled at me, his nostrils flaring. I climbed out of my truck, but he continued with his personal attack. "We're dealing with a missing toddler here. You took your time to get here, officer," he grumbled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. I came as soon as I could." "Zachariah," he said, "I would prefer it you called me by my name." "You better come into the kitchen," he said. "You'll be needing to talk to my wife and my daughter. Just so you know, I've searched the entire farm, and I've looked for my grandchild everywhere. But I know the little bastard has taken him. Nasty piece of work he is. Knocked up my daughter, he did, and only afterwards he wanted to marry her. Can you believe the nerve of it? I thought he was an okay kid, I really did, but I couldn't have been more wrong about him. Boys like him make me sick, taking advantage of young, innocent, impressionable girls like my daughter Greta. Let's just say he'll marry my daughter over my dead body. I think he's taken our grandchild. He's going to pay for this. I hope you'll lock him up when you find him. Throw away the key, so he never sees the light of day again. Come this way, he says. I dutifully follow him. Zachariah walks over to the staircase and barks, "You can come down now. Talk to the officer. Tell him everything you know." I then follow Zachariah into the kitchen. I was relieved to see that when the two reticent women entered the kitchen, Zachariah had left. Both mother and daughter looked like two timorous mice being bullied by the household tabby. It was apparent that they did what they were told. Both women nervously sat down opposite me, their faces puckered by worry lines, and puffy and pink, obviously from tears that they had recently shed. It was clear that both the women were devastated about the missing toddler. They had no comprehension of what could have happened to him. "I understand your little toddler, Jamie, went missing last night. I need you to tell me everything you remember." Greta, the mother of the missing toddler, nods. The tears spill down her cheeks, while her mother tries to comfort her by patting her reassuringly on the back. She's wearing a very grim expression on her face, as if she fears the very worst for her grandson. "I don't know what happened to Jamie, Officer Murray," says Greta obsequiously, "but I need you to find my baby boy. Someone crept in here last night. Someone stole him from me. He's been cruelly abducted. I can't imagine who could do such a dreadful thing. It defies belief." "Your father seems to think that the child's father would have abducted your son. What do you think about that, Greta? Is he barking up the wrong tree?" "Of course he is. Why, the very notion is absolutely ridiculous. Walker would never ever take my child. He knows my baby belongs to me. He'd never ever do such a cruel thing. He loves me.
He'd never hurt me like this. It's not in his nature, you know. He's a very good, decent man."
"Is the father of your child still involved in your son's life, Greta?"
"No, my father won't let me have anything to do with him," says the girl sorrowfully. "He thinks that Walker is a bad man. But he's got such a good heart, officer. He really loves me. But Dad doesn't want him anywhere near the farmhouse, especially after—"
"After he made you pregnant. How old are you, Greta, may I ask?"
"I'm 23, officer."
I look at the young woman incredulously. I can't believe people like Greta actually exist in this day and age. This young woman and her mother allow themselves to be bullied by the likes of Zachariah Miller at the expense of all else. I can tell Greta is hopelessly in love with her boyfriend, the father of her baby. Yet her father's totalitarian dictatorship over her life has robbed her of living her life to the fullest and making her own personal decisions for herself, rather than being persuaded by her father's arbitrary, domineering influences. Why don't women like this stand up for themselves, for goodness sake, instead of allowing a great big overbearing bully to walk all over them and crush them like a boorish bulldozer so that they become like the chaff from a wheat crop? It was ridiculous, I thought. Not only did Zachariah Miller have his wife pinned under his crab-like pincers, but his daughter too. It seemed incongruous. You'd think a promising, intelligent girl like Greta, with her whole life ahead of her, would have ran off with her boyfriend Walker, instead of living under this objectionable man's monocratic wrath. It was clear that both women were frightened of Zachariah, but were foolishly accepting of their plight. "I agree with my daughter, officer," says Mrs. Miller, her eyes brimming with tears. "Someone came in here last night. They stole little Jamie. It's just too dreadful for words. We haven't stopped crying all morning. We leave our kitchen door open at night, officer, and someone crept in here. They took him, but I don't know who could possibly do such a cruel, outrageous thing."
"At what time did your toddler go missing, Greta?"
Greta looks at me earnestly.
"I can't honestly say, officer. I wish I could. I have a baby monitor in my bedroom, and I immediately go into the nursery if my toddler is crying. But he was very good last night. He didn't bother me much, so I got a good night's sleep. I must have visited his bedroom at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and when I came into the nursery later on, my little boy was gone. We heard nothing last night. There were no signs of an intruder, and the gravel outside our house is so loud it would wake the living dead if we were to hear someone. But we heard nothing. It was extraordinarily quiet."
"What time was it when you discovered the empty bassinet?"
"It was about 6:30 in the morning, officer. I found our cat sleeping in the bassinet, where our Jamie should have been, but our toddler was gone. I don't even know how our cat got into the room. The door was almost certainly shut. There were pieces of grass on the floor, a little mud, but nothing else."
"Do you know of anyone that might wish to harm your child, Greta?"
My thoughts were focused on Zachariah.
"I know your husband, Mrs. Miller, is a volatile man at best. Did he—"
"Officer Murray, how dare you suggest Zachariah would ever hurt a hair on Jamie's head? I know he can have a hot temper at times and be a little cranky, but despite everything, he loves his grandchild."
"I have to ask, Mrs. Miller, as your husband has beaten you around from time to time, and you've refused to file charges against him. Someone who has violent tendencies in the household is capable of doing a great deal of damage in my experience, and let's just say, if the wrong buttons are pressed, all hell can break loose."
"Officer Murray, I may be many things, but if my husband laid a single finger on my daughter Greta or my grandson Jamie, I'd be out of this house faster than you could say grease lightning. Zachariah would never lash out at an innocent child, nor has he ever laid a finger on Greta."
"So you're saying it's all right for him to lay a finger on you, Miss Miller? So you're not as important as your daughter Greta and your grandchild Jamie? That's ridiculous, Mrs. Miller. You're equally as important. I wish you would realise that." Officer, I don't know where you're going with this. This is not what you're here about. You need to be out there right now with search parties looking for my grandbaby. My daughter Greta is devastated. Can you not see the state she's in? She's lost her precious baby. He's been abducted. You need to find him now, instead of asking all these irrelevant questions that don't pack any punch. Mrs. Miller, with the greatest of respect, that's exactly what I'm here for, and what I'm intending to do, to find your grandchild. But I won't succeed in doing my job thoroughly if I don't ask you the relevant questions. I hasten to say that often in abduction cases, the answers are far closer to home than you may actually think. Based on what you've told me, it would seem someone abducted Jamie, who knew that you left your kitchen door open at night. So it's very likely they know the movements of your family. Nobody would just naturally know that you keep your kitchen door unlocked. They were able to slip into your house cautiously, without being seen. They knew exactly where they were going, and they successfully stole your toddler. Could you tell me more about your boyfriend, Greta? When did you meet him?
Greta is looking exasperated with me. How many times do I have to tell you, Officer Murray? Walker had absolutely nothing to do with the abduction of Jamie. I met him when my mother wanted some new kitchen cabinets for her birthday. Dad organised for Walker to build her some in the kitchen here. He runs his own carpentry business from some outbuildings at his house with his friend Patrick. He advertises his services at the local post office. His prices are reasonable. When he started revamping the kitchen, that's when I met him. In the beginning, my dad quite liked him, but when Walker started taking me out, my father wasn't very happy. And when I fell pregnant, The woman's face grew white. Well, he threatened Walker. He said that if he ever came near me or this house again, he'd put a bullet in his head. He hurled abuse at Walker, even when Walker wanted to marry me. My father doesn't make idle threats, officer, so I was quite scared for Walker's safety. That's why I ended things with him. I couldn't bear him to come to any harm. It's best we stay away from each other for his own personal safety. I'm telling you this so that you know that my boyfriend would never have taken my baby. Never. When I left the Miller property, the so-called scene of the clandestine abduction that had occurred the previous night, I didn't know what to think. There were two women living in a farmhouse, terrified of Zachariah Miller, whom, although capable of acting out on his threats, would never harm his own grandson or his daughter Greta. In my opinion, once a bully, always a bully. The young woman Greta was not seeing the father of her own baby anymore. She was terribly afraid her own father would harm him. So instead, Greta had ended her loving relationship with Walker in order to protect him from her father's clutches. By all accounts, both women were very good at sacrificing themselves and their own happiness on behalf of Zachariah Miller. He certainly had some kind of powerful hold over both of the women. Both women swore blind that Walker was not capable of snatching his own child. But something wasn't adding up. I felt I'd overlooked an invaluable detail, or that the Millers had been keeping a crucial piece of information from me that would make the puzzle pieces fit together perfectly. I knew that the police search party that I would organise in the next few minutes was unlikely to be very fruitful. I suspected the missing child was long gone. So we would be looking for clues, tyre tracks, muddy footprints, a piece of torn clothing, something like that, but not anything very substantial, I imagined. I decided that the next obvious port of call was to find out the whereabouts of Walker McKeith. But locating the young man was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Both parents were exceedingly guarded and uncooperative when I asked them any questions in this regard, which only served to heighten my suspicion still further, as I believed that Walker was in some way connected to this cryptic mystery. But as to why, I couldn't fathom. Why would he risk so much to steal away his own child from the Miller residence? Nothing was making any sense at all. "What is this about, officer?" says Mrs. McKeith, who was looking exceedingly flustered when I began to ask her awkward, uncomfortable questions about her son.
especially when I asked her if there was a possibility that he might be responsible for abducting her grandson.
"Oh, honestly, officer, I can't believe you're asking me this," she says, wiping the curls of dark hair away from her face. "The idea is nonsensical, absolutely nonsensical. I take offence to your suggestion. I assure you, officer, my son would never abduct his own child. He wouldn't do something like that. This is my grandchild we're talking about. We all want what's best for him. My son knows that little Jamie belongs with his mother. Walker is broken-hearted, officer, not to be involved in his own child's life. But no, he'd never abduct his own son. Suffice to say, officer, we would also love to see our own grandchild. But that Zachariah Miller, no, he's not a good man. He won't let us see our grandchild under any circumstances, unless we take him to court, which we fully intend to do. He can't get away with treating us as outsiders. We deserve to be part of our grandchild's life. Walker is so in love with Greta, but the girl just blew him off. If you ask me, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It's that family. They're hiding something. I know they are. They know exactly where little Jamie is. You mark my words, they do. They'd like to make him disappear off the face of the earth so that we never get to see him again. It's terribly convenient, isn't it? Let me tell you, officer, there's something wrong with that family. They're not right in the head, if you ask me.
You do appreciate, Mrs. McKeith, that I need to locate your son to eliminate him from my inquiries. This is very serious, this investigation. It concerns the abduction of a child. It's crucial we find your grandson, little Jamie. It's very important for me to talk to your son, Walker, to see if he can shed any light on this enigmatic mystery. I feel I need to warn you, Mrs. McKeith. If your son is any way responsible for abducting his child, he could be in serious trouble with the law, and is at very grave risk of being charged with parental abduction. You do realize that?
Look, I don't know the movements of my son, officer. He hasn't been in touch with me. He left his cell phone at home and took his father's old truck, but I've absolutely no idea where he went. It's none of my business anyway what my son gets up to, officer. He's 25 years old, for goodness sake. He's a grown man. He does what he wants. I'll have you know he runs a very successful carpentry business with his friend Patrick Morrison. He's not answerable to me. Now, if you don't mind, I've got things I need to do. And please let me know, Officer Murray, when you do happen to find my grandchild. You wait and see. I'm right about this. Zachariah is behind this. I was to receive the same kind of indifferent, nonchalant, ambiguous response from Walker's father, who was exceedingly protective over his son, and quite affronted that I considered it plausible that his son might actually be responsible for his toddler's abduction.
Officer, this is insanely ridiculous, if you don't mind my saying so. Why are you making these insanely preposterous allegations? If our grandchild has been abducted, look no further than Zachariah Miller. He's behind this. My wife is right. Let me tell you, Sheriff, he gave my son hell for making his daughter Greta pregnant. Swore he would kill him if my son came anywhere near his daughter again. That family is seriously screwed up, officer. They're probably covering up something. You mark my words about that. I'm telling you that monster might be behind his own grandson's disappearance. It's not as far-fetched as it may sound. Nothing will surprise me when it comes to Zachariah. He's nasty. I hear where you're coming from, Mr. McKeith. But I must ask you to humour me for a moment. We cannot find your son Walker anywhere. I need to speak with him urgently, to rule him out as a suspect in his own son's abduction in a police investigation. I'm sure you can appreciate the extreme seriousness of this matter. He was not at the carpenter workshop, which he runs with his business partner Patrick Morrison, because I've just come from there. Nice little thriving business your son is running. I spoke to Patrick Morrison, who informed me that your son took the week off at the very last minute, at a time when the carpentry shop has been inundated with orders. So Patrick was not best pleased to be left in the lurch, and understandably so. He said that your son was behaving very strangely. I need to find him. Do you have any idea where he might have gone? Any idea? Are there any favourite haunts he might gravitate towards that you know about?
Mr. McKeith thought for a moment.
Well, he could have gone back to our cabin by the lake. We enjoy going fishing there from time to time. The family uses the place regularly. It's a regular hangout for us when we need to relax. He could be there, I suppose. But I think if he'd planned to go there, he would have informed us about that.
I took down the address and proceeded along my way to the McKeith holiday cabin by the lake. On my drive to the remote location, I received a message from dispatch, informing me that now the young woman Greta, the mother of the missing toddler, had suddenly vanished into thin air. So now the police were stepping up the search, not only to look for a little toddler, but for its mother as well. 2 people had gone missing in the spate of a few hours, and I knew it was connected. I mean, how could it not be? I answered the phone in my car to Mrs. Miller. She was at the other end of the line.
Something dreadful's happened, Officer Murray. Not only has my grandchild been abducted, but so has my daughter. She's just disappeared into thin air. We've looked for her absolutely everywhere. I've searched the entire farm. She's nowhere to be seen. Nobody saw her just vanish like that. Her cell phone is on the kitchen table, but she's nowhere to be seen. She wouldn't go anywhere without her cell phone. I'm frantic with worry. I've checked all her messages, but everything is deleted.
Calm down, Mrs. Miller, will you? Take in a deep breath. Breathe in slowly and breathe out. I've got a feeling I know where your daughter Greta is. But my most judicious advice is for you to remain calm and only panic if there's something to panic about. And I have a feeling that we don't need to worry about Greta just yet. I will be in touch, I said, disconnecting the call. I didn't know exactly what was going on, but my gut instincts told me that I needed to get to that cabin as fast as I could, and all would soon be revealed. I've always trusted my instinctive hunches. My GPS directed me to the location. Before long, I found myself driving down a white, sandy, arenaceous driveway, through the viridescent countryside, with the prepossessing, sparkling mountain views, and a plethora of maple, sycamore, and dogwood trees, richly abundant with gold, red, and yellow leaves. Then I saw it, a quaint, charmingly rustic-looking old miner's cabin, cosily nestled against some undulating verdant hills that happily billowed up against an azure blue sky, overlooking a serene silvery lake, with a sandy, rather pebbly beach, and a homespun organic fishing pier. The bewitching lake was fringed by weeping willows, with pretty feather-boa-like leaves that skimmed their elegant boughs over the reflective, twinkling veneer. I parked my truck next to a run-down old truck that looked so obsolete and outmoded, while the sides of the truck were covered in rust and dents. I think it looked pretty battered and beaten up, but it looked like it was still being used. I imagined it belonged to Walker, and made one hell of a noise. The keys were still in the ignition, the door unlocked, so I imagined Walker was very much around. There was a yellow light on in the cabin, and I could smell the pleasing aroma of wood smoke and pine needles that fired the air. I quietly ascended the steps of the porch and walked to the front door, almost knowing instinctively what I would find. But I pulled out my weapon, muzzling it at my side. "Walker McKeith, this is the police. I need you to come out here at once with your hands above your head." The door opened. I'm greeted to the sight of Walker McKeith, a handsome-looking young man, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, and by his side was the Miller girl, who was holding a chubby-looking toddler in her hands with big dimples and round, inquiring blue eyes. This was the child that dozens of my officers had been scouring the countryside for hours before. These 2 nonchalant young people
Had a hell of a lot of explaining to do as far as I was concerned. I could see the young Miller girl, looking startled to see me. Her face reddens. She looks slightly sheepish as she studies her boyfriend, and then me, as if she wants to say something, but the words are struggling to come out. Finally she chides. I know what you're thinking, Officer Murray, but this is not what you think it is.
So I see you found little Jamie, very safe and well,
I say sarcastically.
It's very nice of you, Greta, to have informed us about this. I have men on the beat as I speak, still conducting a search for you and your little toddler, knocking on doors, asking people questions. And all the time, you're perfectly safe, and so is your son.
Greta looked shamefaced, regarding me bashfully, with repentant, contrite, round eyes. I was going to call, Officer Murray. I really was, she says obsequiously, but neither of us had our cell phones available. I deliberately left mine at home. I deleted all the messages, you see.
Young lady, you have a lot of explaining to do. You should have contacted me at once when you found your child. What on earth is going on here? Have you any idea how many hours we've wasted looking for that toddler of yours? And by all accounts, he's now perfectly fine. At the very least, you could be charged with wasting police time and taxpayers' money. I think the two of you have some serious explaining to do. Beyond all that, your mother has reported you missing, Greta. She's having kittens as I speak, wondering what has happened to you. She's fearing the very worst. I'm also going to have to let my officers know that the mother and toddler that have been missing have now been found safe and well.
I'm sorry, officer, says Walker ruefully. He intercedes in the conversation.
I know I need to disentangle the confusion here and expound about what is really going on. You're damn right, son, I say. I'm listening, and I'm warning you this better be good. Child abduction is a serious offence. You better come in, says Walker. Please take a seat, officer. Put that revolver of yours away. I'm not about to pull any stunts on you, I promise. Besides, the only weapon I have at my disposal is a baseball bat, and a broken one at that.
I visibly relax at the cordial invitation, and am led into a cosy, agreeable-looking living room, with a welcoming fire crackling away merrily in the hearth, where bright orange flames are snapping away at firewood, and the whole cabin smells of pine. Greta tells me to take a seat on a cushy-looking upholstered white wicker chair. I take a seat, finding myself wondering how on earth Walker is going to explain why he surreptitiously abducted Jamie in the middle of the night at the Miller farmhouse. It's clear to me that this is what happened. I also knew emphatically that at the time Greta knew nothing about this. You couldn't fake a mother's concern, and Greta had been very distressed to discover little Jamie had gone. So in the beginning she had not known anything about this. So what the hell was going on? I give Walker a pointed look. You could be facing parental abduction charges, young man, so you better start talking now. Walker grimaces. He glances up at me with regretful blue eyes, brimming with sincerity. Look, officer, I know what I did was wrong, and I apologize for that most profusely, but I really felt I didn't have a choice in the matter. You see, officer, I love my son Jamie, as much as I love Greta here. But much like any other responsible parent, I want what's best for my son. I'm sure you know Greta's father, Zachariah Miller. Well, to put it mildly, he's not exactly the most approachable man you've ever met. He can't easily be reasoned with. I know he bullies his wife and Greta here very successfully, manipulating them to abide by his belief system. I hasten to say, is not always right. The man is hot-headed, impulsive, opinionated, arrogant, and mulishly stubborn. He won't always listen to sound reasoning or professional judicious advice. I knew in this disadvantageous environment that my little boy Jamie didn't stand even a fighting chance, so I had to intervene. I'm sorry, young man. You're going to have to do better than that, I say. These dissimilarities between you and Zachariah
don't give you reason or excuse to enter a house in the middle of the night and abduct your son. Officer Murray, I don't think you understand exactly what I'm trying to tell you. Jamie has cancer. Leukemia, to be exact. The condition is serious. That's if it's not treated correctly. Although if it's treated right, the cancer will be destroyed, as the prognosis is very good. The young man's face cracks, with the passion of a devoted father that wants the very best for his son, and my heart softens as I can sense the young man's pain. I watched in stunned silence as Greta rocks her toddler on her lap. The toddler looks up at me through its bright blue eyes, as if I'm the most interesting thing he's ever seen. I think he's admiring my police uniform and cowboy hat, which I have to admit is rather dapper. The young toddler's got lots of taste. Who knows, he might follow in my footsteps one day. Officer, I have to tell you, Walker's absolutely right. I've come around to his way of thinking. You see, my father dictates everything in our household. We always abide by his stringent, strict rules, without ever thinking about the ramifications or consequences of some of our choices. Little Jamie here has had chemo, officer, for his condition, which made him incredibly sick, lethargic and listless. It was so destroying for us to see what the harrowing effects of the chemo was doing to him. Yet despite the fact that he was grievously sick, the chemo was actually working. My father put a stop to it, insisting that the chemo was killing his grandson, and that we needed to give my boy alternative natural treatments, which we did. But my child has been getting sicker. I failed to see it, officer. Chemo is the only thing that we can actually do that will actually kill the cancer. All well and good, and I understand what you're saying. But it doesn't explain why in the middle of the night you would abduct your own child, Walker, without telling anyone what you were doing and why you were doing it.
I'm glad he abducted our boy, officer, says Greta. Really, really glad. It was the only thing he could do. You see, officer, when the police were searching, I got a message from Walker on my cell phone, telling me to get an Uber to the fishing cabin, and that he had our toddler here. He said I wasn't to tell anyone, was to trust him, and to leave my cell phone at home, and to delete all my messages. You see, Officer Murray, Walker has been doing lots of research into our child's condition. If my son doesn't continue with his chemotherapy treatment, he'll die. It may have made him seriously ill, but it's killing the cancer very successfully, and that's what we need to do. You see, Officer, Walker knew if he didn't get our child away from my home and engaged me in this earnest conversation, away from the dominating influences of a very persuasive, dogmatic father, that I might not see the light of day. He's made me realize what a fool I've been, officer. If there's any crime committed against my son, it's not acknowledging what the best course of action is for him that will ultimately save his life. I have allowed my father to tell me what to think rather than to think for myself, and to study all the facts. I'm determined for Jamie to continue with the chemotherapy. It's in his best interests, officer. I know my father will not agree with my decision, but I'm going to stand up to him for the very first time in my life, for my son's sake. I'm not returning home either, officer. I love Walker, and I always have, and I'm going to marry him, regardless of what my father has to say about the matter. We're a family. We need to stick together as a team.
Good on you, girl. I'm very proud of you for having so much courage. I'm glad you've finally come to your senses. You should never allow someone else to influence the choices you make for your own life. It is your life, after all, is it not? You need to research the scientific facts about your son's illness and make up your own minds about the things you need to do for him. And it seems that you have made some very judicious choices regarding him, and I certainly commend and applaud you for that. Officer, am I going to be charged with parental abduction? That's not necessary. It seems the two of you are a team, and are in agreement as to the protocol for your son's treatment. So you're on exactly the same page. We can safely say that this was a misunderstanding. I'm a father myself. If I'd been wearing your shoes, Walker, I may have made similar choices to you. It took guts doing what you did, but I'm very glad that you are resuming the treatment for your child, and good luck on that.
Walker's account. Little did I know that on the night I was to abduct my son from the Miller farmhouse, that something so idiosyncratic would actually happen, that would rock my comprehension of what I really knew about the world. I have always been a very straightforward type of person. I'm not easily persuaded to believe in things that you cannot see, for they carry no weight with me, and urban legends depicting stories of cryptid creatures were just fairy tales to me, nothing more. The night when I parked my father's prehistoric, annoying, noisy truck in the inconspicuous grassy clearing, fringed by a few very gnarled-looking trees, I was terrified that every single noise I made would be audible, especially when my rubber soles pounded the grass beneath my feet. I could hear the sounds of the crickets and frogs serenading the night, the distant hoot of an owl, and a howl from a coyote, but nothing was louder to me than the thumping sound of my heart. I was terrified about what I was about to do. But when I watched a huge, gutsy male lion on Animal Planet fighting off 3 powerful male lions to protect his cubs, I realized he'd fight to the death for his cubs, as I should for my own son, regardless of the consequences. That single male lion did not hesitate to fight his corner, coming against 3 intimidating opponents, but his confidence and assertiveness scared his young intimidators away. But probably not for very long, because they would be back, and next time he might not be so lucky. Yet never once did this male lion bat an eyelid or even flinch to fight for the younglings under his charge. I knew I needed to do exactly the same for my son, even if ultimately I had to face the wrath of the law, or worse still, an encounter with Zachariah Miller on the staircase, holding a rifle to my head. I knew how volatile that man was. If he had a hint of what I planned to do, I could potentially be a goner, possibly pushing up the daisies. So when I climbed out of my truck, I felt as if the whole world knew what I was doing. But as I began to cautiously trek through the knee-high grass, moving stealthily towards the Miller farmhouse, I got the distinct impression I was being watched. I told myself I was imagining things, but the feeling was all-consuming. It sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine. I assure you, when you're about to do something under the cloak and dagger of darkness, you do not want to be seen by anything or anyone. It makes you feel uncomfortably vulnerable and very insecure. I pulled my torch out of my plaid jacket. It might be a small torch, but the portable small little thing packs a powerful punch. So I scanned the trees with my light, and I know I saw this huge figure, a silhouette of something very sizable, moving behind a tree. It happened so quickly that I began to doubt myself. The night was so dusky, its tenebrous density shrouded everything in its mist, so that the silhouettes of the trees and the vegetation were lost behind the obscure, murky cover. The moon was not giving much light off, for she had reclined from her night duties, so it was easy to see strange shadows and imagine you'd seen something that was there when nothing was there at all. So I persuaded myself that my mind was taunting me, teasing me, making fun of my angst, like a provocative kid at Halloween, determined to scare the living daylights out of you. As I manoeuvred myself through the long grass that was wet with dew, I could hear feet behind me, pressing down the grass, snapping and popping fallen twigs. But when I turned around, nothing was there. Was I going completely mad? There was a punnelling wind, lifting up fallen leaves from the trees, tossing them up in the air like celestial butterflies. Also it whipped against my face. But I told myself it had to be these rustling leaves that I was hearing, not someone following me, snapping twigs under heavy feet. But in my gut, I knew very differently. In truth, my prime focus was on one thing alone, getting into that stone farmhouse and retrieving my toddler. I was terrified that once I lifted him out of the bassinet, he might scream loudly, waking up the entire household. But I soon realized that the demanding cat I encountered, that let out soft mews and purred profusely, was more of a threat to awakening the household than my child was. I'll never forget how fired up I was with adrenaline that night, as every nerve cell in my body was firing on all its cylinders. My stomach was churning like a frenzied food processor, and when I managed to leave the house with my child in my arms, I just hightailed it through the meadow as fast as I could, glancing back very briefly over my shoulders to check that I didn't see a light being turned on in the house, or hear loud voices shouting after me. But there was nothing. By this time my child was whimpering, twisting and turning in my arms. There was a quiet chill in the air, and my kid did not like the change in temperature that contrasted dramatically from his warm bassinet. I strapped my toddler in a kiddie seat next to mine and started up the engine. Oh, I hated my father's old truck. If that truck was a person, it would be one of those cantankerously loud, disagreeable people screaming the odds, determined to get everybody's undivided attention. "Howdy, I'm over here," sort of thing. My truck started up with a loud humming sound. It began to rattle and shake precariously, making the kind of noise you hear when frying pans are being bashed together, or when cutlery rattles around in a kitchen drawer. I knew I was far enough from the farmhouse not to wake the people up, but by God did that car make a commotion. The next thing I know, I'm driving down the long driveway, and I hear feet pounding behind me. Something is beginning to throw pebbles at my truck. I freak out, thinking someone at the farmhouse saw me and is running after me. So I'm almost hyperventilating as I put my feet on the gas pedal, on a road that does not invite speedy acceleration, because it's full of potholes and cracks and large pebbles. So my truck began unsteadily wobbling around. My kid began to make a peculiar noise, the likes of such I've never ever heard before. I realized he didn't like my rattling car. The noise obviously scared him. But I couldn't concern myself with such trivialities. I needed to get the hell out of here as fast as I could. I could not for the life of me perceive who was running after me. I've never known anyone to be this speedy before. Whoever they were, they should seriously consider entering the Olympics for speed racing. I remember thinking bloody hell as I kept hearing ponderous feet behind my truck, and my truck continued to be besieged with flying pebbles. It was only when I see the figure running by my side, keeping pace with me, trying to get my attention, that my blood freezes. For a moment I seriously think that I'm dreaming. I have to be. This just cannot be real. The creature overtakes my driver's side window and runs in front of my truck, standing in the middle of the road, waving her overlong arms up and down, so that I'm actually forced to stop unless I run her over. The strange creature standing in the middle of the road is a Bigfoot. I am gobsmacked by this. My mouth drops open so wide. I stare at the idiosyncratic creature with gog eyes, but I'm far too astonished to be afraid. The creature has her arms above her head. She's waving at me madly, frantically even. She stands on two powerful feet at a lofty 8 foot tall. She has small breasts, one larger than the other, and an exceedingly muscular body, with powerful buttocks and shoulders. She boasts a ripped six-pack beneath her long dark hair. I observe her face to be very human, with deep-set dark eyes, a chiseled chin, high cheekbones. The creature runs over to my truck, pounding on the back door. I turn around to look at what she's pointing at, and to my astonishment there's a frightened little creature, possibly a little bigger than my own toddler, sitting in the back seat of my truck, with wide, frightened eyes. I realize that this was the creature that had made the strange noise earlier on that I thought came from my own son. I climb out of the truck, opening the back door, to help out the little Bigfoot baby that had been on my back seat. I am so stunned by what has just happened. I had left the door to my truck open, but I never anticipated a Bigfoot baby to find its way onto my back seat. I watch as the Bigfoot mother reunites with her little child. I can see joy, relief, and thankfulness in her eyes. She glances up at me gratefully. For a moment our eyes meet, and in truth I've never seen such kind, soulful eyes. The Bigfoot lifts her baby onto her shoulders. The baby begins to pull at her hair with its little hands, as if it's some kind of a game. I close the door behind me, returning to the front seat of my car, still studying the Bigfoot curiously, who appears to be very thankful. I think it was her humanness and her maternal energy that literally hijacked my fear. Granted, she was powerful in stature and weight, but she was no different to any other mother that loves and adores her child. The creature nods at me and says something in a language I couldn't understand, but I think she said, "I'll pay you back for your kindness," and then she glides away. I stood there motionless for a long time in the middle of the road, like someone who's been physically stunned, beaten over the head with a large baseball bat, and are completely disorientated and confused. I then climb back into my truck and make the journey back to my father's cabin. Me and Greta had been staying at the cabin for a few days. Our son was getting his chemotherapy treatments, and although Zachariah had kicked up a huge fuss about it, I was to learn that Officer Murray had gone to visit the man, delivering him some much-needed home truths. I got the surprise of my life when he actually phoned me and told me I was welcome to marry his daughter Greta. He even forgave me for abducting his grandchild. He had realised it was for the best that Jamie was going to get his full chemo sessions.
"You're a good father. You stuck your neck out for my grandchild. I underestimated you, Walker. You're not such a pushover after all. Please accept my big apologies."
Even more astonishingly, he told me he was going to a counsellor to manage his anger and violent outbursts.
"Officer Murray is right," he told me. "My wife deserves much better. Frankly, I'm surprised she hasn't divorced me long time ago. I need to fix myself up."
I don't know what it is that Officer Murray said to Zachariah, but he deserves a gold medal. I've never known Zachariah to listen to anyone a day in his life, but he had listened to Officer Murray. So against all the odds, it was incredulous. It was on the third night at our stay in the cabin that something very peculiar happened. It was a cool night, very cool. Me and Greta were enjoying a fire in the cabin after eating some fish that I'd caught earlier on in the day. The fish was delicious. It melted on the tongue. I cooked it with butter and garlic and served it with mashed potatoes and salad. Little Jamie was fast asleep in the bassinet, having had a tough day of chemotherapy that had beaten the very life out of him. But I wasn't worried. I knew my son was going to make a full recovery. Earlier on in the day, Officer Murray's wife had dropped us off some clothes for our toddler, telling us she wished us the best. Everyone had been so good to us, and all had our backs. But I didn't know that somebody else, someone particularly special, was also looking out for us. I awoke in the middle of the night to hear a strange knocking sound. It was gentle and unobtrusive. It sounded rather like a tree branch bashing against the walls of the cabin. It was not loud, but curious enough to get my attention. I glanced at Greta. She remained fast asleep on the bed, passed out from an exhausting day spent at the hospital. I climbed out of my bed, walking around the cabin. I could see the silhouette of a tall figure waving at me from outside the glass pane of the window. I recognized her at once and smiled. It was the Bigfoot I'd encountered on the road, whose baby had ended up in the back of my truck. I concluded that the little child wanted to play in the back of my truck, and the female Bigfoot, assuming I was going to be away indefinitely, had given her kid free rein to sit on the back seat and play, not realizing I would return as quickly as I did and drive off with her child in the back seat. My heart leapt with excitement seeing the Bigfoot, as my encounter with her had been extremely congenial, and I had instinctively warmed to the unusual creature. Within moments of meeting her, I have to admit. I hurriedly rushed towards the cabin door, unbolting it. The Bigfoot glides confidently towards me. I feel surprisingly comfortable in her presence, like I never normally feel in the company of strangers. But this idiosyncratic creature is as natural to be around as the trees in the woodgrove. She moves towards me so graciously, placing a little pebble in my hand. Imotabi salina, hikasho bovona, hino lani no kosana sina. Put it in the water when you bathe your baby. The stone will give her strength. It's healing. He'll be better soon.
"Thank you,"
I said to her, unable to comprehend that I'm hearing her speaking directly into my head. When I look up at her, I know I didn't imagine that voice. By the way she's looking at me, I know she spoke to me. Our paths were meant to cross, she says. Umpoti dasi topo, hitala no. All will be well. When your son is better, leave the stone for me on your table over there, and I will come and collect it. Umpoti basanabula, asina dona vanina. She glides away. I stood there for half an hour, flummoxed, asking myself, did that really happen? Needless to say, I did exactly what the Bigfoot told me to do. I put the small pebble in my baby's bathwater. The pebble looked like an ordinary white stone, and seemed pretty unremarkable. But when I put it into the water, it became purple, resembling an amethyst, and the water we bathed our baby in also turned purple. Greta was amazed, as no sooner had she bathed our baby in the bath water, everything changed. He became stronger, and he dazzled the doctors by being cleared of cancer only a couple of days later. My son was better, so I put the stone back on the table as I had promised the Bigfoot, and the very next day it was gone. I have no real comprehension of what Bigfoots actually are, but I do believe they're from the angelic realm, sent to help us. Let's just say the outlandish way I encountered the creature never ceases to amaze me. I am now happily married to my wife Greta. My son is a remarkably healthy boy. And dare I say it, Zachariah Miller seems to have had a personality transplant. He's become a more lovable character in our own hometown, and the Red Sea doesn't part when he enters a bar. So yes, miracles do happen in this world, and angels may cross the thresholds of our lives in the most unlikely of ways. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.